Greetings, Mr. and Mrs. Middle America, and all the ships at sea. This is Ian Putnam on Coast to Coast AM, and to the hostile invading alien armies hovering silently behind their cloaking devices just outside of Earth's atmosphere. Remember, eat the Canadians first. And that was very relevant in the first 2 hours of last night's conversation, Friday night on Coast to Coast. When we had on Bill Konkoleski, if you have Coast Insider, go back and listen to that. We were talking about the most recent preliminary assessment addendum. The Pentagon, the Department of Defense, will not release actually the assessment. They won't release their report on UAPs until 2026 or something like that. But they keep releasing these limited sketches, essentially, of what some of the material might be by the time this report comes out. And they added earlier this week, without giving us any details or categorizations or anything that's really helpful, they added 171 unexplainable phenomenon, and they asked essentially, for people to respond to that or just to sit tight and wait for the big report. But talking to Bill Konkoleski last night, he's the director of MUFON in Michigan, with whom we've had a conversation a couple of times on Coast to Coast. Their clearance rate is 95% at Michigan MUFON. So they can disprove 95% of the claims that come in, leaving out of, say, an annual number of 200, about 10 that they can't explain, whereas the Pentagon's number and percentages were way higher, but tantalizingly few details to go along with it, except that we know that these reports have come from Navy pilots, from Air Force pilots. They've come from the Department of Defense, but they've also come from commercial aviation, and so that's all they'll tell us. I think there's some ground sightings as well that pertain to this, but it really doesn't give us a lot to go on, except for their number is much higher. So what are they not doing right that Michigan MUFON can clear out 95% of the claims that are made and still come up with a solid 10? And the government does 171 that are posted. So I don't know. But it was an interesting conversation, and there was a lot of callers, and it was a fun open lines, too. So if you've got Coast Insider, go back and enjoy that. And if you are listening right now over terrestrial radio sometime and you're stuck somewhere, remember, too, you can always listen to the first hour of Coast to Coast AM through YouTube. Just subscribe right there. And this is going to be one of those shows you're going to want to listen for. I've been fascinated with the scholarship on the investigation into the death of Princess Diana since I saw last Sunday's interview with Prince Harry, right? Or the Duke, whatever. And here he was saying that he still doesn't buy it. And he still suspects, and did for a long time in his life, much more vehemently in the past, but still harbors feelings that somehow that she had been targeted and murdered. And for whatever you think about Harry, I just thought it was an interesting revelation. And in fact, I haven't read Spare, which was this huge book, came out, over 1 million sold. I don't know what more else is in there on that subject, but I do know that it made me go and do sort of a deep dive on exactly where does the conversation leave off on the official reports. And that got me thinking about the royal family in general, and then we bring in Glynis McCants, and we'll do that in just a few minutes, and we'll talk about the numerology of the royal family. She used to write pieces for the Daily Mail doing their numbers, running the numbers. And she says she was at 100% in her predictions. We'll get back to that in just a moment. If we're talking about millions, though, wow, what a big night for somebody in Maine. They were the sole winner of the 1.3 plus, and change $1 billion pot in the Mega Millions. That's a lot of money for one person, even if you take the one-time cash payout. And this one person is going to be taking home that giant pot of money. I don't think yet they've released more details. If they have, I didn't catch it. But it goes to this. It speaks back to a story that we kept hearing about, which is that billionaires, and this has been sort of bubbling up all throughout 2021 and 2022, that a lot of very, very wealthy people are trying to, quote, cure death. And they're working on the death cure. But it would only be for the people who are the mega rich. And these people will want to have a kind of immortality where they would be able to enjoy their billions of dollars for the rest of their lives. But what form will that take? And we thought, well, this is where we bring in Professor Bart Kosko. Dr. Kosko has been on this before. We'll talk about this from a couple of different standpoints. Where exactly do we stand on the technology to create holograms, interactive holograms of people? And then what about the actual science itself of immortality? Back to that coming up later on next hour. But first, Glynis McCants standing by. Get out your pad and your paper. Because really, as we're always fond of saying, Glynis has your number. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. I have a lot of fun on Twitter, and if you follow me at Deacon Punnett, you'll see some photos that I posted last night during the show, a la Art Bell back in the day. But it was my distinct pleasure over the last couple of years to get the occasional DM from Glynis McCants. It's been a while, though. How are you doing, Glynis?
Hi, how are you? Happy New Year.
And to you, but we haven't chatted recently.
No, except through Twitter.
I know. It's funny to me.
Well, it's great to talk to you tonight. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, thank you for agreeing to it. So I know that you wrote for the Daily Mail. I know that I want to drill into that a little bit, too. But I understand just kind of aside from that, you've been a bit of a royal watcher.
Oh, yes. And to clarify, Maggie Harbour is the gal who would interview me for the Daily Mail. So she loves my work. She's actually a major coast-to-coast follower. That's how she found me originally.
Oh, good.
And so she would interview me on the Daily Mail, but then I would also do the TV show, and I would cover the royals. I mean, as those babies started popping out, every time I'd cover how are they going to get along with the family. You know, what do the numbers tell us? They tell us so much. And what was exciting for me, going back to 2018, when Prince Harry first hooked up with Meghan, I was able to run the numbers, and I could see the problem. I could see what would lay ahead and what my concern was, and that's what's been playing out.
Well, we'll get to that. I will say, in preparation for your visit, I've been promoting it a little bit, and I got, the usual weird pushback that says, this is not the way that they do it in the Bible. And I thought, you don't actually read the Bible. The Bible's full of numerology. If there's
full of numerology, yes.
One consistent theme beginning to end, it's gematria in the Bible.
It really is. When you look in the Bible and you look at those numbers, the interpretation breaks down to the same as numerology.
Right.
Yeah, it does not interfere with spirituality or faith. It just doesn't.
Well, not to mention even just the idea of numbers as representing wholeness or numbers representing brokenness. And we don't even, we think of 666, or whether other people argue it really should be 616 as the sign of the beast or whatever. It's still a lot of numbers. And the original readers, be they Hebrew or Greek readers, they caught all of that. They wasn't outside of, and that was a big part of even what might have been considered the wise men that came to the manger. Was that they were as much astrologists as they were astronomers. They were as much into that type of understanding of science with numerology and signs and symbols as they were in anything that we would consider to be hard science today.
Very, very true. And you do see those patterns, like when we talk about that number 7 in the Bible. Sure enough, it is about, the ocean and lessons and test of faith. And the number 4, every time you look at it, Ian, when you break down energy, it's about learning the hard way, but learning. It's about what do we do? When you see those numbers follow you around, what are they telling you? There's always a message.
Well, and the number 12, which, the tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples. 12 pops up all the time, and that's always interesting when we look at the number 13, as this is typical numerology,
right?
Is it's just one off from perfect. It's one off from good. So whether it had been 11 or 13, it represented something symbolically that it wasn't 12.
And do you end up seeing the number 12 personally? Do you see it?
Again, so remember where we are in this. I'm really interested in the subject, but I've never been able to codify it in any useful way for me. I find it interesting when you talk about it because I know that you see these things in sort of in categories and ways.
Yes.
To me, I just see numbers everywhere. So, I mean, I don't. But I'm fascinated by that. But what you're talking about, like the classic clock structure where people say they always see 12-12 on a clock and that kind of thing.
Well, most of them talk about 11-11, which is just Uri Geller would tell you the universe is wide open to what it is you want. So focusing for that minute on what's going on with you, whether it's I need to find a home where I can live or a new job where I can make good money, a lot of people use that energy and have good results.
Well, the 12, we were talking about the 12 signs of the zodiac.
Uh-huh.
But so originally there had been 13, and there was one that's missing, which I thought was really, that was fascinating.
Tripped up everything, right?
Yeah.
And, hence the reason I just stick to numerology, because that has not changed. But I will tell you something funny. The number 12, obviously quarterbacks, a lot of them wear that number 12.
Right.
I just find if the energy is compatible to you, it helps you have more success. That is what I know. But also, when you look at 1, 2, if you add it together, it becomes 3. Well, 1 is ambition, 2 is love, and 3 promotes communication. So there's magic in that combination. Like, right. I personally love that number.
Well, and I thought you're the only one I ever talk about with this sort of thing, but I think 8 is what you put on in my mind. So I do look for 8s, but that's because of you. And so when I see it, whenever I see anything to do with an 8, I always like the way 8 because it looks like an infinity and it feels right. But it was always my favorite number to draw as a child. I always liked to draw an 8, and I feel for whatever reason drawn to 8. But that kind of brings us back to the royal family. And if you broke down relationships by numbers, what do you see, Glynis McCants, in the way in which the members of the royal family are laid out in the universe by their numbers?
Well, I find this family remarkable. And Queen Elizabeth, when she passed away, it's, of course, interesting. The woman was in her 90s, but she was just someone we were so used to that when she passed away, it was still a shock.
Yeah.
People were like, oh, my gosh, what do you mean she's not here? So when I ran her numbers, it made me realize how come that woman was able to stay above the fray, no matter what the scandals, right? No matter what came her way, the world was mourning her. Well, that was in her numerology. And I'll tell you, keeping it simple, yes, it's true. There's a numerology blueprint. 3 numbers come from a name. 3 numbers come from a birthday. The 6 numbers tell you a story. And then you can compare it to someone else. Some numbers are a challenge to each other, and some are compatible. So going to her, here's why she did so well with it. She was a 7 life path. She also had a 7 attitude. She knew how to step back. She knew how not to jump in or say something she'd regret later. And even when Harry talks about her, he says, and then my grandmother sat there quietly listening. Remember, he says that. He talks about the way she did that. And honestly, we can all take a page from a person like that, right? Because sometimes when we speak and don't think about what we say, we have to deal with the repercussions.
So when you were, if you looked at the numbers from when they were first betrothed, you could anticipate the success of the relationship between the Queen Elizabeth II and the Queen consort that she had married. You're thinking that already you could tell that how that relationship was going to go.
No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Okay.
Doing numerology as long as I have, 1995 is when I first went on air, like radio, TV, and helping people. But
Right.
I studied it for years before that. When I look at numbers, they come to life for me. And so when Meghan Markle and Prince Harry got together, I could see where they were compatible, but I also saw their challenges. But the concern I had was Kate Middleton and Meghan.
Okay.
Because when I looked at that I could see they had 4 challenge numbers out of 6. I can't emphasize how hard it is when you hang out with someone that has that many challenges. It means they misinterpret you all the time. And these are women, right? Powerful women. You've got Prince William, who loves his wife, and you've got Harry, who loves his fiancée at the time. They're going to stand by their woman, and as a result, that is where the poison began. I will stand by that. That was 2018. I could see it. I was hoping it wouldn't be the case, but it certainly turned out to be.
So, but even going back to Queen Elizabeth, do you think that when what did you know or what did you suspect as you looked at those numbers on how her children and then her grandchildren were going to fare in the royal family?
Well, here's what I could see. The number 2 kept coming up with the men. So you got Prince William, who's a 2-life path, King Charles, who's a 2-life path, and his father, Prince Philip, a 2-life path. What does that mean? A 2 is someone who is willing, if they admire the leader, they're okay following. They're okay supporting. So that's energy. So I found it fascinating. She was surrounded by people who would support her, who would stand by her. You see?
Right.
And yet, Prince Harry is not a 2. He's a 1-life path. And that's why he has cut a different path. That's why he's speaking up. For him, this was all about family. And when I say that, I mean his family, right? His wife, his child. Where does that come from? The number 6. He was born on a 6th day. He has a 6 attitude. That is rescuing the damsel in distress.
And that would be
people that go ahead.
That'd be Meghan, is the damsel.
Yes, he saw her as she certainly was at the time. The damsel in distress, where it was like, look, we know through the tabloids what happened with the British press. The woman was attacked in ways that she was not remotely prepared for, and when he saw it and asked for help, and this I certainly believe to be documented, it was Charles, King Charles now, who said to him, look, this happens, almost to say you need to suck it up, right? We are the royal family. We have to deal with this. We cannot do anything about it. But he couldn't take that, and that is in his chart. But what people also need to understand, he was very, very close to his grandmother. You see, in numerology, they were a natural match, Ian. That's what we hope for. Natural match means natural rapport. Right. They did get along very well.
Okay. How about and it was interesting in the most recent interview, he talked about everybody, like nobody got along with Camilla. And everybody would say, don't, beg their father, don't marry her, don't make her queen, all of that.
Yes.
Was that anything you ever saw coming?
Are you kidding? I would have been one of the kids saying the same thing, wouldn't I? All that does is bring us back to Lady Diana. Okay? The woman was beloved. We adored her. When she passed away, I don't know anyone who did not cry or feel the pain of losing her. So who's the villain in that story? It becomes Camilla, because what we know is that Prince Charles was in love with her forever. Right. He always loved her, but she was married to somebody else. And so when it came full circle, you can't blame the sons for not wanting that woman to be their stepmother.
But is there anything in the numbers that would say they're sort of doomed to not get along with Camilla?
You know what? Remember, they were actually surprised that she did not turn out to be the wicked stepmother, to be clear. So it wasn't like she was really cruel or mean to them. But there were things, when you're already hurt. See, this goes back to the number 9. If you're asking a specific number, 9 have issues with abandonment. And William and Harry both have it. They have that 9. And when they lost their mother, no matter what, that's a form of abandonment, isn't it?
Yeah. So I see that, and it brings me back to Diana's death. Mm. And how comfortable are you when you look at the numbers of somebody's life to be able to anticipate something like longevity? Does that ever come up?
Here's what comes up. There are personal year cycles that I become concerned. So I'm going to give you a current example. Lisa Marie Presley. Okay? Right. When we heard she had a cardiac arrest, I instantly looked up the year she was in, okay, because that's what I do. The cycle of 8, sometimes we become a victim with our health. 9 means it's like a wrapping up, coming to completion. Well, she had just entered the cycle of 1, and I said to myself, well, she's either going to complete the 9-year cycle here or move right on to her next spiritual level.
All right, hang on to that. We'll come there. And I want to ask you about the numerology of the night that Diana was killed. And then step aside from the numbers. If you're a royal watcher, where are you with the current research into how she died? And then Bart Kosko coming up next hour. Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Now to the top of the hour, we're going to be talking about two princes, Harry and William, but also about their mother, Princess Diana. It was, I guess, surprising to me. I raised my eyebrow anyway when Harry still seemed very unconvinced that the official report, tells the real story of what happened to his mother. So we thought we'd bring on a fresh perspective on that, and somebody who is both a royal watcher and a numerologist, Glynis McCants, coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Glynis McCants has love by the numbers, which is probably a good time with Valentine's Day coming up, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Do you see a big kiss around this time of year? Yeah. And how many times has this book gone into new editions? Because it's been around for a while.
Well, it was originally a hard copy. Then we added more information for the paper. But what I'm doing, there's an audiobook version that's coming out.
Oh, good.
And my goal is to get it out in February. Good. I had been promising it, and then I fell off track with the lovely pandemic.
Yeah.
You know.
And I hope you're the one doing the voiceover because you got a great voice.
Thank you. I am doing the voice, yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
And then, but that's interesting to me because it's cool that you've got that book. But do you have anything else in your back pocket you still want to kick out before?
Oh yeah, no, I'm working on something that's very appropriate for what we've been through. Like these last couple of years, a lot of people lost their way. You know, yeah. A lot of us fell into depression or just felt sad, and they're having a hard time getting back on track. And I'm working on something to help them do that. So I'm really excited about that. That is this year.
And I don't know that my numbers back me up on this or not, but I have to say, just for whatever reason, I feel like I'm going into a great year.
Well, can you give me the month and day? What's your birthday?
March 3rd, 1960. Okay. But I mean, I just feel like it. You know,
okay.
There's something about this year that just makes me I just feel energized kind of a little bit. Yeah.
So keeping it simple, first we just take a look at your life path number. Now, you know, in your case, you are a 4 life path. And what does that even mean? The 4 is the one seeking knowledge. Every time you learn something new, you feel called to share it with others. Like if you can make a difference that way, you will.
Right. Yeah, try.
Now, this world number just shifted. 2023, when you break it down, 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 3 is 7. Okay? You add that to the month and day you were born. So you said 3 plus 3, right?
Yep.
March 3rd. That's a 6. So 7 plus 6 is 13. 1 plus 3 is 4. You just entered a personal year of 4, and you're a 4 life path, which makes it your year.
There you go. I love that.
That's what you picked up. No, I'm serious. What it does, you feel it. As quickly as the year shifts into the new cycle, you're like, this is different.
Yeah.
You know, as a matter of fact, you're going to feel like more grounded. It helps you focus. It makes things more clear to you. But whenever your life path is in alignment with your personal year cycle, that's good news.
Yeah, I had a personal thing. I don't know if you saw. I tweeted it out. 2022 was just one of those years where, for whatever reason, I pulled a hamstring. Originally, it was on the back of my Achilles, and then I did it again. And it was behind my knee. I didn't break it. And I was trying to avoid surgery, and then the pills had to do this. And so one thing led to another. And I was getting up every morning. I was taking like 6 pills, and I thought, I don't want this anymore. So that was my New Year's resolution for 2023, was that I would be pill-free in 2023. And I'm pretty close to that.
Well, here's what's also good news. Not only can you make that happen, but when you're in a cycle of 4, it makes you want to learn what you don't know, right? So when you were taking those pills, you took them because you were trying to feel better, but now you're thinking there's got to be a better way. Yeah. And I would say, as you discover what that is, please share it with your listeners.
I'll do that. Well, you'll be the first to know. I'll DM you. Yes. I'll let you know. All right. So we were talking about the Princess Diana thing, and so let's get back to that, because as both a royal watcher, Glynis McCants has been following the story as an observer, but also then through the lens of her specialty in numerology. So as you look at that night, right? As you see that night, the night that she was killed, is there anything significant about that would back up a claim that said this was not like a cascading failure, as they would call it, like a failure cascade of, too many paparazzi, too much speed, maybe a little alcohol, maybe whatever, but that there was something more nefarious involved?
Well, there's a couple things. One, I look at each day energy, right? Because every day has energy in it. For Lady Diana, that day was not in alignment with her. Like I created those numerology calendars where I tell you what's good for you. Right. In that day, it would be called a good day for you personally. Do not count on anyone else. Well, wasn't someone else driving? Yeah. This woman was not in charge that day. Yeah. So when the speeding happened, and here's what I would also say, it was as if she had a bounty on her head, because if memory serves, you could get $1 million for a photo of that woman. That's how big it was back then. So it really was a frenzy, and it was heartbreaking. The other thing I noticed about what she was going through, I look at the person you're dating. Remember, she was very much involved with Dodi Al-Fayed, right?
Right. Yep.
Well, I'm the one who will look at that chart and say, is this good? Meaning, is this a good relationship for her? So check it out. There's a pattern in numerology, and she shares this pattern with Dodi. Let me tell you what other couples had this pattern. Natalie Wood with Robert Wagner, John F. Kennedy Jr. with Caroline Kennedy, and I had one other. Who else was famous? Dodi, Diana, John Kennedy with Caroline, and one other was Farrah Fawcett with Ryan O'Neal. So really? Even though she, quote-unquote, she didn't die like in a crash of any kind, but it was a bad relationship, right? It was toxic. See, when the numbers are toxic, as I told you, it's a breakdown in communication. So who knows what happened in the car? Did Diana say, please slow down, and no one listened? We don't know what happened. But I cannot blame Prince Harry for feeling he doesn't have the whole story. Of course I believe that's true, and I do think more will be revealed.
So that's an interesting point about power, because then it wasn't just that somebody else was driving. Right. Dodi Fayed's, as I understand it, his whole part of their relationship was based on his fortune and his ability to take care of her and to protect her and the children, very much like how Jackie Kennedy got involved with Aristotle Onassis. Right. That money gave them a wall between the paparazzi and whatever. Right. And so in her case, though, then there was the security that was assigned to her. Then there's Dodi Al-Fayed, and then there's the driver, and then there's the paparazzi who are chasing him. That makes an interesting point about how if that were just numerologically speaking, if that were a bad day, and her best play that day would have been stay at home, have a cuppa, and
certainly not get involved. You know where she always did best? When you have that 7 energy, remember, love of the ocean. You see that woman, whenever she was near water, she was her happiest, right? Like on a cruise ship or something where she was having fun. The driving, we already know, and I know this to be true, the speeding, the alcohol, and then these people, the paparazzi chasing for money. They wanted that photo. And it's just heartbreaking. But I want to say something else to prove my point regarding Kate Middleton and Meghan.
Yeah.
I was looking at the brothers because, we're hearing stories, right? We heard they had a fight, and
right.
The brothers like, get up and fight, and he didn't. Do you know, when I say there's 6 numbers, you can either have a compatible number, a natural match number, or a challenge. When I look at their chart, it's compatible, natural match, compatible, natural match. That means these two loved each other. They did have a bond. Not only did they lose their mother, they shared that pain, right? They compared notes. But when Meghan came along, technically, even though they're in love and they do have a soulmate connection, but they also have challenge numbers. And what does a challenge number do? It promotes chemistry. And that's what you do see in Harry. That, remember on the wedding day, I don't know if you watched, where he's like, you look so beautiful. Like, he was
right.
just so enamored. And so this has not been easy. Like, I know that as a couple, they have breakdown in communication. But I promise you, when Prince William first met her, I believe he liked her just fine. I really do. And then it became a problem.
It became contaminated?
Well, it also became competitive. Remember that. Like, it's true, Kate Middleton is a beautiful woman, but so is Meghan Markle. And when Meghan showed up, it was this whole different spin. And I think there was a defensiveness to that. And it's true. You can relate to this. Technically, Meghan's a double 4, born on a 4-day, 4-life path. One of the things a 4 must be careful, it's what they say. You'll think you're just being honest, but people can misinterpret, right?
Sure.
Like, you're just being direct, and they're like, oh, you're rude.
Right.
Remember what he ended up saying. William is like, she's rude, she's abrasive, she's difficult. That is what a 4 can be accused of. And then they're in shock. They're like, whoa, I was just telling the truth.
Right.
I meant no harm.
Right.
But see, when you're toxic, you misinterpret. So Kate misinterpreted Meghan from the very beginning.
Yeah, I went through that with my MMPI when I was going to seminary, and they gave me all these different tests, right? And so they called me into the office before I was admitted, and they said, we got some good news and some bad news. Your personality type and where you fall on the spectrum here on your, ENTP or whatever I was, and I don't even remember what it was, but wherever I fell on that scale and combined with something else, they say we only see about 1% of people with your particular alignment that go into seminary. So the good news is professors will love the fact that you're there because you're going to stir the pot. You will start conversations. You will be engaged, and people will react to you. The bad news is you will be memorable for all the wrong reasons. And he said you should know that going in, that people will, you will say something that you think is so boring, and it'll be shocking to other people. And I think, no. And they said, just know that now, because you may not want to go through that for 3.5 years in seminary. And they said there's also one other person who's in your class that has that same we won't tell you who it is, but you will find each other immediately. and I thought that was so funny. So I was in my first 2 weeks of disorientation or something like that for seminary, and this woman walked in. I think she was from Czechoslovakia or Romania, and she had ripped jeans and it was camouflage shirt, and part of her butt was hanging out of the back of the jeans where it's cut just at the top of her thigh. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And then she got the exact treatment that I got through the whole semester.
Of course.
I thought it was so funny.
But it's true. So that goes back to you. To you, it's like, look, if I'm telling the truth, that's all that matters. And then I end up saying to a 4, it's still an art form. You got to find those words.
Right. Yeah. So what about Dodi Al-Fayed? Because you bring him up. So Could it be that Princess Diana, I mean, if we're just going to look at this numerologically, if it were a bad day for Princess Diana, maybe it was a great day for Dodi El-Fayed, and
here's the problem. I'm actually talking about a relationship. Like, I'm telling you that sometimes you have a pattern, and because I've seen it again and again, just like the famous people I just cited with you, I have couples that have that number pattern. Sure enough, maybe the husband, he didn't even drink, and then they get married, he becomes a major alcoholic. So what I'm telling you is it can bring out the worst in us when it's a real challenge. And that's why, so back then, before this happened, there was no accident yet, when I saw the number pattern between them, I was concerned.
Right. And yet it's hard to predict something like this.
Right.
But I do think that's an interesting event. If we looked at the relationship here, just go with me and find out how crazy this thought is. If we looked at the numbers of everybody in the limousine, and we thought, okay, wait, everybody there has formed a temporary relationship. Everybody is in relationship with each other in some form or another inside of that car. Mm-hmm. And could you do a relationship number of all of the people inside of the car and make a determination about the success of that grouping of people together?
Well, sure, especially the driver, though, you see?
Yeah.
Because there was someone driving, I would run the numbers on that driver and see what personal year cycle they're in. What kind of day is it for them? That would be my concern. Right. You know, because no matter what, this woman at the time that Lady Diana passed, she was truly the most famous woman in the world, right?
Right.
Everyone had eyes on Diana. And you know why she was so loved? I'm going to go right back to Queen Elizabeth. Lady Diana was a 7, just like the Queen. So she, even though she could be loving and sweet, she still had mystery. We didn't know her whole story. That's why when she did that interview and kind of talked some of her truth, it was so shocking because no one knew her story. But when you have mystery, it makes people want more. And you know who else had it? Marilyn Monroe. Think how these people, they pass away, but it doesn't matter. We still want to know more.
So Trevor Rees-Jones was the British bodyguard who was badly injured in that car crash but survived. Mm-hmm. So he would be another interesting guy to run the numbers on. And then Henri Paul was the driver. I couldn't remember his name. I had to go look it up. I agree. So put them all together and shake it up. I'd like to see what that.
I would like to see the one that did survive because, you know, there is something said about the energy of a day when everyone else does not make it, but you do. Right. I'm all for figuring that out because, hey, everything is vibration. And she was going through so much at that time, but I promise you, in that car, she was not in control whatsoever. And I think it's true, Dodi was trying to protect her, but he didn't realize that his driver had been drinking.
But they all could have survived if they'd been wearing seatbelts.
Yeah, isn't that remarkable as well? So it was all, again, it's not paying attention to those details, but then this is what I want to say about Harry, because of course I'm listening. We all have social media. People are very comfortable ripping Meghan Markle to shreds. Right. They're putting down Harry. But I say this, try to remember this child lost his mother, and he was 12 years old. And in his chart, I can see it. If he could have protected her in some way, he would have. It's in his chart. The number 6, remember what I said, rescuing the damsel in distress. What he's doing right now, he's crusading for his mother.
Sure.
He's literally, listen to what he says. It's like, look, she was dating a man. He wasn't white. You know, he's trying to compare the two to say that she was being harassed for her decisions as he has been. And so what did he do? He said, what upset him about his father, he thought, shouldn't my dad try harder than what was before him instead of saying we have to suck it up? That's how he felt. So he is now the one changing the situation to say, I'm taking my child and my wife. I will do this differently.
What do the numbers say in the minute we have left? What do the numbers say about the future of the royal family?
Well, I tell you, William and Kate are incredibly compatible in numerology. So that is where I see it being celebrated once again. I think for King Charles and Camilla, it will not be as easy because here's the difference. Remember I said the mama knows how to keep her emotions to herself? Mm-hmm. Charles doesn't. He does speak his mind. We will see him in the moods that he gets in. And William has the ability to turn on the charm when the light hits him. So I think it's here to stay. I don't see it ending.
Yeah, well, Charles definitely favors his father with an odd comment here and there. Although maybe at this age he's learned, better to keep his tongue. But
he's trying. I think he's trying. But this happened suddenly, and here he is. So I think he's trying to figure it all out.
Could you do the chart of the House of Windsor and figure out what the numerology is based on? What at least was the tentative birthday of the House of Windsor?
Well, yes. Remember, the title of anything is vibration. So the question is it compatible to one person versus another? It all matters. The address we live in, that's why I encourage people to alter their address if they're not happy, if the energy is a challenge to them, how to make it better. So, yeah, it all matters.
All right. Well, don't change your numbers. That way we'll always be able to get a hold of you. Thank you, Glynis McCants.
Thank
you. Always a pleasure. I'll look for you online.
Thank you.
And that was great. That was just what I was hoping for. But I'm still searching for more on the research of the official report. So there may be an addendum to this coming up on Coast to Coast. Dr. Bart Kosko, back to discuss on immortality next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punter. Is it possible that with enough money you could really finally live forever? Or how far are we away from an era where the Jeff Bezos of the world could create the perfect body or a version of that which would give them immortality? Let's put aside, for the time being, let's just put aside the moral or ethical debate on something like that. And let's just say, what is possible? Are we talking about a digital representation of ourselves? We've talked about this a little bit before on Coast to Coast. How's that project moving along? Where we would have essentially a computer representation of our mind, of our pattern of thinking, and we could couple that with a hologram and give a representation of what we would have been like if we were still alive, which would cost a ton of money to do that. Or are we looking at, as some people have been speculating about in some recent articles, one of which appeared recently in Wired magazine, are we getting to a phase when tech billionaires, just to give an example, could actually live forever? They could, quote unquote, cure death. We'll talk about that with our guest, Dr. Bart Kosko, coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. We linked up the profile page for Professor Bart Kosko, Ph.D., J.D., on Coast to Coast AM. You'll find it on the website. Bart, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Ian?
Good. When does your semester start again?
I'm on sabbatical, so it actually is delayed for me, but it started on Monday.
You rock. I don't think I'll be teaching long enough to qualify for a sabbatical. My sabbatical will be my retirement. So, it's funny. Before we get started, so I was reminded of this when I went to review your homepage, and I think this is true of some of the best universities. So here you are in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, right, in the Signal and Image Processing Institute, and this will sound harsh, and I don't mean it to, but I mean, gosh, the website design looks like it's Lycos. It looks like Opera 1.0 or something. I mean, I think they got to update that a little bit for a school with the reputation of USC. I think they've got to have a better layout design.
Very colorful reputation. That's partly my fault, Ian, because a while back, a student who I helped out with something offered to design my webpage, and I said, I don't want the other stuff I see on it. intentions and research areas. I only want to publish content, nothing else.
That's good.
Only my published content. So I've posted videos and journal papers and patents and other things, and no paywall. And I don't want in any way come in books, any way come between that. So if I could make that more accessible, I would. The only thing I've not done, and there's a lot of requests for this, I have a lot of note sets on a wide range of subjects to make it accessible. Probability lectures, quantum mechanics, Maxwell's equations. I've learned 1,000 tricks over the decades, and I'd like to share that with more people, and I may do that. But otherwise, it's there simply as my information giveaway. And
I totally love that. And I love the humility about that, Bart. But you could do better than Mosaic 1.0. That's
absolutely true.
I'm just going to venture out there and say maybe Mosaic 2.0. All right, so... Yeah, so listen, I so admire the fact that you're willing to have this conversation in any form. You're one of the few people, I think, that can attack this from a couple of different standpoints, mostly because of your law degree, but also obviously with your PhD. So let's start with this. Lots of conversations suddenly about billionaires being able to make themselves immortal in one form or another. We can talk about it in a physical form. We can talk about it in a digital form. Where do you want to start?
I think physical first.
Okay.
And immortal, of course, is, I think, unattainable in a universe of entropy. I mean, eventually everything dies, but that eventually, Ian, can be a very, very long time. And the other thing is, although death is inevitable, doesn't in principle have to be permanent. I mean, technically, death is an engineering problem, a big one, a grand one, but one we're quite likely to conquer. And because of the effects of digital technology and the rapid speed up, Moore's law is still alive and kicking, doubling circuit density about every 2 years. Right. It's likely to come about through something like that rather than just the physical. So the crudest way to extend your life right now, besides staying healthy as long as you can, a lot of things you can do, eating right, exercising, and so forth. The crudest way is simply not to destroy your brain when you first die. And the only practical way of doing that is to pump it full, in effect, of antifreeze and, quote-unquote, freeze it, really to vitrify it, to very slowly lower it to about minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit in liquid nitrogen. And once you've done that, pretty much everything except a few quantum effects have stopped, and you've avoided a lot of the ice damage that would happen if you just jumped into a freezer for a long time. And then you're waiting maybe a very long time, but time is on your side at that point for some kind of restoration, maybe not of your entire body, maybe a digital representation, but in the old take on this in cryonics, and I am someone who has signed up for that, as I've made clear since my book Fuzzy Thinking 30 years ago. Right. But I'm just saying, in that world, and the old idea was if you just stored your head, for example, we'd grow your body back from a head stump and all would be fine. But the crucial thing is the information that makes you is in your synapses in your brain. And if you burn it, or if you dissolve it through burial, embalming, etc., you've lost it. You've encountered what we call information death, and that is irreversible.
Why would you want to do that? What inspires you to break that barrier?
I'd like to pick up a few more degrees. I'm just getting going. Like you, I'm about to turn 63. I'm doing everything I can and really just getting going in life. But the key thing is I want to die on my terms. Right. Again, I think in the future, and I think this will be routine, it'll be a version of that old saying that changed, that the coward dies many deaths, but the brave die only one. I think the ordinary person will probably die many times if they choose to. Some people may be in for kind of a sport. But I want to do it on my terms when I'm ready to go, or maybe just take some time out. I don't know if you ever read the story by that short novel by Arthur C. Clarke called The City in the Stars. No. And it said way in the future, in people a billion years in the future, we've gone to the stars, we've done everything we've dreamed about, people kind of get bored, and they come back, and then periodically they commit themselves to the blue flames to be reconstructed at some other point. But right now, we're tied to the old rules of Darwin, and they just don't match our culture, our digital technology, and we can do a lot better.
And they certainly don't match our society within the context of the way laws are written in terms of right, the legislation that gives us money at a certain age and then pays until another certain age, and our system would go totally broke if everybody was living forever.
Yeah, that's an interesting proposition. I think what you're referring to is some of the old property law, and there's a very famous rule in there that bedevils students in property. I'm talking real property, not intellectual property, and it's called RAP, not the music, but the rule against perpetuities. And it comes out of merry old England, as does most of our laws, and it in effect says that you can't extend trust-type systems beyond 21 years in a so-called life and being. No one's really known what that's meant. There's been jokes about it, even made by judges on the bench. So what's happened really since the 90s is that several states, because states have so much power in their constitutional system, on all property law is state law. For example, thank God there's no federal property law. And as a consequence, some states have abolished the rule against perpetuity. Kentucky has. Other states, you're in Kansas, I'm in California, Hawaii, many others have extended it to 90 years. Colorado recently extended it to 1,000 years. And I think Wyoming also. And some states, like I said, have gotten rid of it completely, and Texas lets it stay in place. So you can set up a trust-type structure. I don't mean a charitable trust, which has always been set up, but your personal selfish trust to go on for a very long time. Now, combine that, and this is where I think is getting to your point, with what's known in finance, a theorem called the Rule of 72. And let me just remind your listeners what that means. If this is an approximation, but if you put money in the bank at a constant rate of return of, let's say, 10%, if you divide that into 72, so 72 divided by 10 tells you in about 7 years your money will double. Contrary-wise, if it were a 7% rate of return, and good luck in getting that, and dividing that into the 72, it would take about 10 years. So you might ask, well, if I had money, billionaire or poor man, if I put $1 or $1 billion right now into the stock market, into the S&P 500, Apple, Microsoft, and firms like that, that's 10.5% compound interest. Probably your best bet, all else held constant, unless you're Warren Buffett, who gets 20.1%, by the way, and the only person in history to do that for 50 years. But if you have 10.5% rate of return like S&P, so after 10 years, your dollar becomes $2.71. I did the calculation. After 100 years, your dollar becomes $21,700. After 200 years, $470 million plus dollars. And here we go. And after 500 years, it would become $5 billion trillion. I mean, the whole system breaks down from there, just growing at the ordinary rate at which our tech market and our market economy grows. So extending your life, though, a little bit can make a big difference here just in the rate of compounding. Because it's exponential.
Yeah, and which is great for those people who have money to invest. The majority of I would guess, I don't know what the figures are, but I would assume that the majority of Americans do not have much money to invest beyond, say, a mutual fund or a 401k. Right. And so they depend on Social Security, and Social Security depends on somebody dying at a time when where the money that they have put into Social Security is about equal to what they've taken out, or not much more than that. And it certainly couldn't sustain if people started taking Social Security at, say, age 67, but they're not dying until 137.
That's right. I mean, that clearly will have to be adjusted. It is starting to scale up. I think you and I were in the first group because we're born in 1960.
Right.
That instead of taking it out at 65, you got to wait till 67, and it just continues after that. Yeah, absolutely. But you're right. The average person now is concerned with 10+% inflation if you really factor in all the other costs, and that works like the rule of 72, but against you. And people are holding too much debt. By the way, there is a concept that's been out. It's called a libertarian nudge, and very controversial. And Professor Cass Sunstein proposed this. He's at Harvard University. But
I've heard of him, but I haven't heard of this.
Oh, yeah, this is probably his most famous, and Robert Thaler's most famous idea. And that is, if you look at the experiment that we've had in this country in voluntary pension funding, it's been an utter failure, no matter how you look at it. If you look at the total amount of funding, because it counts a lot of rich people's wealth, you get something like in savings of $250,000, and that's not enough to live on in retirement. But the average person, factoring out the super rich, I think the average person has less than $100,000 in their retirement. So the idea is this: the nudge, which restricts liberty in just a tiny amount, trying to make you be a little bit more rational, would set as a default that you opt in to whatever wage program you have with your employer to a certain amount of savings for your retirement. But it's libertarian in the sense that you can always opt out. Right now, the default is that you are opted out, and most people just don't know any better, or
and they don't opt in.
Right. But a lot of estimates that would make a big difference. But you still need an economy growing fast, and you can't have this kind of inflation that we have that's undermining, I think, everybody, even the rich folks. But the effect on the middle class and poor, I think, is it's staggering. We haven't seen this since we were kids in the 70s, basically, that kind of thing. But one thing you can do is, again, I'm trying to avoid the word mandatory, but as a default, trying to get everybody saving. And if you just introduce kids, as I've tried to do over the years, to what I just told you, the rule of 72. And if we had time and if we had a whiteboard, I would give you the mathematical proof of why the rule of 72 is actually a theorem by expanding a property, an infinite series of the logarithm. But when kids see that and they get that and they realize they can have time on their side, and that we tend to think about life in general in a linear way. And indeed, if you look at an exponential, and if you expand it, the first term is linear. But then it's quadratic, then it's cubic, and then it's quartic. And then if you can allow time, you need probably a good 20 years to handle the ups and downs. You can, whatever your station in life, you can substantially improve it over having just, as we used to say in Kansas, just eating the seed corn.
Right. But even just so, by the way, we could take Social Security starting at 65. The amount is it's small. So if you wait until 67, then it's a much more, sort of understandable, workable payout. 70 is when it's pretty good. So if anybody can hold off to 70 who was born after 1960, you get a pretty good deal, but you got to last till 70. What does the rule of 72 have? Is that related at all to the average lifespan of human males in America, which is about 72, isn't it, I think?
I think we're better than that now. I think it's a little beyond that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a mathematical principle. So I use an example. I'm up in the mountains right now outside of L.A. We got a lot of pine trees. If I just look at a young pine tree and estimate how much it's growing per year, let's say it's growing 10% a year, and it's currently 8 feet, and I say, okay, how many years will it take until it's 16 feet tall? The Rule 72 applies to that. It would be 7 years. So it is a general fact of compounding at a constant growth rate, whether it's to the average male or whether it's to a pine tree or any amount of money. And by the way, Ben Franklin was aware of this. And I read it once in his autobiography or his essays, but he knew by putting up a small amount of money and allowing it to be handled in a charitable trust, which is relatively new in that time, you can get a lot of the kind of trust that we have today. I don't know if the Franklin Institute's funded that way, but the idea of using that for your own wealth, that's way beyond an ordinary lifespan of 78 or 80 or so years is the proposition before us.
I had to look it up, but life expectancy in the United States fell in the last couple of years to 77 in 2020 and now 76, but that's an average between men and women in 2021. And men still die die younger than women. And so then you have this whole other thing about spousal support, and then you've got one, right? I mean, there's a whole thing there about some of these places where women are feeling great at 75, but there's no men around for them there's very few men. They compete a lot for companionship amongst males because their life expectancy is much better, especially if they've got good health care.
But I have some good news here. I just found this study, came out a couple of days ago. I read studies for fun, and I teach stats. And it's out of Harvard. It's in the journal American Medical Association's Internal Medicine. It says healthy eating patterns and risk of total and cause-specific mortality. What it found was, looking at over 100,000 men and women, non-causal study, associative, for several years, they were average 50 years plus, that they simply live longer if they ate the things your doctor tells you to eat.
Right.
So lots of raw fruits and vegetables and seeds and nuts and healthy oils and fats, and basically the Mediterranean diet. So I think a lot of that went the other way during COVID. The diets didn't improve, and there was too much alcohol and so forth. That might account for that.
Too much Uber Eats. It got too easy. By the way, have you seen do you know why it is that men tend to die earlier than their wives?
I heard it was because of hormonal effects, testosterone type effects.
The old joke is
not a menopausal structure.
The old joke is because they want to, but I think I always thought that was funny on Ed Sullivan show. All right, so that's where we'll leave it for now. But I want to get back to that subject. You're hitting like one home run after another. So I know this is like batting practice for you, but here we are. And we're looking at immortality both from a physical standpoint. I do want to get back to the digital as well. And this concept that somehow billionaires could live forever or that they could cure death. Which reminds me, then I want to run through the vocabulary of this conversation and see what you agree with and disagree with. Dr. Bart Kosko next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So we're talking, though, about how billionaires could be the only ones that could find a kind of immortality. I think it was Tennyson, right, who said something about that everything must die eventually. But we don't know what eventually means anymore. That was what Dr. Bart Kosko said last half hour. Exactly how are we defining eventually? And we could, and we seem to have, a lot more control over our life expectancy already. The average person does, just based on their diet and the choices they're going to make about what they're going to feed their brain and their vital organs. It's one of the reasons why I gave up meat predominantly. I still eat a little fish and occasionally a stray piece of bacon, which demands that somebody consume it. But it's pretty rare, and most of the time I stick away from fatty foods and a low-sugar diet. I kind of go Mediterranean in a lot of ways without the lamb. But this is where, for a lot of other people, this is not a challenge. They're just going to eat, drink, and be merry, and then they'll die early, and they'll be happy, and that's okay. And smoking and alcohol has a lot to do with it, too. So there will be some people who will choose not to pursue immortality, but there could be a kind of immortal billionaire class, or people that are very well funded anyway, who could choose to try to live as long as possible. Bart himself is going to have his head cryogenically frozen, and that's one path. We'll talk about some of the other ones, and I want to run by the vocabulary of this conversation with him. I was sort of struck by it when I was reviewing it earlier this week. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Dr. Bart Kosko from USC. We're talking about I'd say a spate of articles about this concept of immortality, especially that was being funded by tech billionaires, and that they could choose to be creatively active for decades past while any of their peers passed. But Bart, before we go any further, let me ask you about this. We all know that nomenclature has a way of changing over time, right? That nobody was sure what to call people who were driving cars just around the turn of the last century. They called them automobilists. And there was a bunch of different terms before they finally came to motorists. And then there was even a time when you were talking about somebody who was a car driver, you didn't even use the word car. So we know this will probably change, but let me ask you how you feel about terms like is this cheating death, the idea of living way beyond life expectancy, or is it curing death?
I would prefer the latter, because again, I see death as an engineering problem, a big one, but one that doesn't, its solution, so far as we know, likely will not involve trying to go faster than the speed of light or something like that, which would make it physically impossible. On the other hand, it is cheating simple Darwinian death, in which case you and I, my friend, would have long since moved on to our reward. Remember, the basic theory of aging, it's got a technical name called antagonistic pleiotropy, but what it means is what we view as aging as a side effect of what it took to have a healthy fertility, which kind of maxes out for humans around 20, 25. I mean, the teenage boy was designed for a reason, and there were no grandparents to speak of, or that kind of culture, until very, very recently. Just to give you a sense of that, if we think of all that there is in modern culture, it's no more than 10,000 years. That's only 500 generations. That's trivial in terms of the shaping of your genes and your hormones, your whole biological chassis. So in that sense, Ian, we are cheating that kind of death. People died quickly. Or I should say they died early, not quickly, painfully. And, we've already beaten that. It used to be the average male died a little over 100 years ago in his 40s. Right. And now it's closer to 80. Yeah. Now, what's the upper bound on that? Maybe 120?
You think?
With the current system? Well, that's a lot of the theories are. Maybe if we don't make some changes, which I think we will, to the genome, and the reason is, by the way, the genome, it's encoded in DNA. That's just a piece of information. And in principle, you can program that like any other piece of software. And then with a variety of proposed techniques, maybe alter that and regrow yourself a body or a third arm or whatever it happens to be. But until that kind of thing happens, it looks like our, quote, envelope is 120 years.
So this is why it's funny when we look at the Constitution and we say, well, they wanted wise older people at age 35 to be senators or whatever, but or presidents. You had to be, and that was considered to be old age in many ways, and that's even when we use the term middle age, somebody referred to in one of my classes last year as somebody who was 36 was middle age, and they just simply took the life expectancy that they perceived and then divided it by 2.
That's right. So you make that key point. It's not just fuzzy, which means ambiguous boundaries, but it's also time-varying, what we call non-stationary, and that does evolve with time.
Yeah. So although we say middle age when we're talking about 55, kind of roughly, we say, oh, that person is entering into middle age, then that would make sense. Then your number of 120 actually gets pretty reasonable because that would become the new official middle age. It wouldn't be, right? I mean,
it's just that, there's so many things that work against you. For example, one estimate on what would happen to the human lifespan if you wiped out all cancer. And the probability that you get cancer is something like 1 in 4 in your lifetime, if not higher. It's only like 2 or 3 years to get extended to your life. So I think the bigger problem is cardiovascular, and that's why I think you're seeing studies like I just reported, the one from Harvard, and others, that just by improving your diet and exercising more, getting away from the processed food that's exploded since World War II, you can add somewhat. But there's still some really tight genetic constraints. Well, we're at the absolute. It's like taking one of the Model T cars from 100 years ago and saying, just how fast can we go if we keep souping it up? There's a limit to that. At some point, you have to change structurally the design.
Right. And so our design, though, is something which we inherited, right? We can't redesign an entire human, perhaps, although when you're saying the genome, to what extent can we redesign the chassis other than, say, growing an extra arm in case you need one later on or something like that? What more could we be doing, do you think, just even starting in infancy, where we go, well, we're going to go in and whereas now we think about the palette of the shots that we give a child in order to make their, to reduce the possibilities of measles or mumps or whatever. What are you saying, that there could be some standard kind of thing that we could do to adjust a baby's life by making what bigger, what smaller? How would that work?
Well, a couple of things here. So first, let me just say that if we could view your genome as, just bear with me here mathematically, as a dot on a sheet of paper, and the sheet of paper would be the set of all possible genomes. On that sheet, then, all human genomes. The current estimate, there have been 108 billion, maybe 110 humans to have walked the Earth. When you and I were born in 1960, there were 3 billion. Now there's almost 9. And I think it was 1805 until we got to 1 billion. That's not a lot of people, but you take 110 billion, all those genomes, and it is a tiny, tiny, minuscule dot on that sheet of paper. And if you divide it by the whole sheet of paper, it's essentially 0. So what that says is even close to the dot of all lived human genomes, you can make slight variations just due to noise, and you would not recognize it. It would still be human, let alone further away in genome space. So that's the first point to understand. The combinatorial complexity of the human genome is truly staggering. It's beyond cosmological. It's so vast, it's hard to get a sense around that kind of a number. So there's a lot to play with. Second, I just got a patent in on something, you can see it on my website, called quantum annealing. And actually what the patent was a way to improve quantum annealing with noise boosting. And what this is about is trying to find low-cost solutions to problems with lots of variables. Modifying the genome is a grand example. But just making something like beer, you've got several ingredients, or the new design of a 747 or 7X7, whatever it's going to be, airplane, there's hundreds of thousands of variables, maybe millions of variables. So you can view the way we search those surfaces, whether it's called machine learning or formal optimization, as kind of looking at a vast egg carton, but irregular size egg wells. And we're trying to get to ideally the smallest, but just to a reasonably small one. And the way we've done that to date is, in effect, shaken that egg carton, put a marble in it, kind of shake it. So in a thermal way, the shaking corresponds to heat, very much like you would heat up metal, and then cool it very slowly to a low energy or crystalline state, like making of a samurai sword does that. So that has a lot of advantages, but it's very slow. The idea of quantum annealing is brilliant. It uses quantum tunneling or burrowing. Rather than to shake the marble, in some sense, burrows through those egg wells and finds, if not the lowest, a very low one. So if you can come up with a set of criteria for your child before you have the child, then in principle, for example, health, reduce the various genes involved in cancer. By the way, why do we have such genes? Again, this antagonistic pleiotropy, because where we come from is not just a swamp, but the ancient oceans, so many hundreds of millions of years ago and beyond, where the most important thing, once we had a cell, was to keep making copies of the cell. And we've had kind of a devil's bargain with that property, and it continues in the form, so far as we know, in the form of cancer. But you probably want to cut that back and do other things. And if you were to do that, then maybe if you could search long enough with enough quantum supercomputers, all of which will be available, then you could find some really good, healthy, beautiful genomes for babies. The other thing, Ian, if you take this view that you and I are just dots on the genome sheet, then what you are is, in effect, the average between mom and dad dot. And there's no reason, once you have that, by the way, that you couldn't have more than two parents. So you mentioned how words change. The word infant, I think, is going to change in a dramatic way. I can easily see, I mean, it's not hard to envision, and I talk about this in the book Cool Earth, the novel Cool Earth, where this is already happening, violations of copyright and other law. You could have parents saying, gee, I'd sure like to add a tiny dose off the black market of Tom Cruise's genome, or whoever the celebrity of the day happens to be.
Right.
So you could have a child with three parents, and technically the British Parliament has already allowed in a very special case something like that. But you could have big, you could have, it'd be an odd thing, but you could have the true average American child, which takes the statistical average of everybody's current living genome, and God forbid you get a result, but there would be. So that opens a lot of doors. And well before that happens is the curing of a lot of diseases and other things, and the replacement of those parts.
Well, in some ways, wouldn't we say that there are, whenever we give somebody a factory-made antibiotic or something which is originally derived from some other cells somewhere, or if we're talking about stem cell research that already were kind of introducing a third parent, it may be just a rudimentary version of that, but I never really thought about it as... Well, we are, but we're not mixing their DNA information per se. We kind of did that in a different way, though, with the COVID vaccines, the mRNA, where we're introducing something we designed into the COVID
a piece of the COVID genome, and many other ones coming, by the way. And I should point out that there's been a lot of problems, obviously, with those vaccines, and a lot of good things about them, too. But it does opens itself the door, these lipid nanoparticles that many of us got injected with, to targeted anti-cancer therapies. And the other one, you mentioned the article in Wired, which was talking about senolytics. And what senolytics is about is killing zombie cells. Zombie cells are cells that no longer divide in a healthy, regular way, and they don't die off. And so they just kind of hang around. They often have 2 or 3 nuclei in them, and they tend to attract, as you get older, that may have a purpose when you're younger, they tend to attract a lot of inflammation. And in mouse and other studies, if you can remove and kill, basically, some of the zombies, kind of like one of those zombie movies, if you can do that, the mouse lives longer, healthier characteristics, and diet seems to be part of that. And senolytics, a lot of this work, incidentally, if you're interested, comes out of the Mayo Clinic, Dr. James Kirkland in particular. But so I saw one study I believe he was involved with. They just look at a lot of phenols that you could eat, a lot of healthy greens and berries, and which one killed the most of these zombie cells. And it was kind of a toss-up, as I recall, between quercetin, which is very common in green leafy vegetables, quercus from oak, and fisetin, which gives the strawberries its redness. But there's many other things they're doing. It's a massive amount of patent warfare, I should point out there, as throughout the anti-aging industry. But it looks like if you can knock out as you age some of those cells, those zombie cells, those senescent cells, then with whatever the senolytic technique, then so much the better. But it's still just slowing down what Darwin gave us. And again, it looks like your outer bound is 120 years.
Okay. So the best case scenario for somebody like a Jeff Bezos would still be 120 years, which isn't all that different from, say, some of those, fabled Civil War veterans that lived to be 117, or some woman,
right,
who drank, they always say, she had 1 glass of whiskey every day, and she lived to be 115.
Yeah, which is an interesting thing. And you can hear one of those old Civil War vets. You can on YouTube. It's interesting to hear how they spoke in those eras. I think it was in the 1940s. The gentleman was recorded. I think the Bezos case and many others will change. I'm just talking about diet and exercise with their body.
Right.
But if you can replace your parts, and I mean in particular your vascular tree, your heart, things like that, as inevitably that's coming. Again, a tremendous amount of research on this, and I use the term patent warfare because I think that's where these battles are in intellectual property. But if you can do that, and I think you can do well beyond 120. Just as one example, again, in my book, Cool Earth, which is how things can go terribly wrong if we try to move the Earth-Moon system a little bit away from the sun to cool it. You could also move it back in an ice age, and there's some technical mechanism for doing that. Works in theory, can go wrong. By that point, I think a lot of people will have what I call nano blood, a little bit of artificial blood, because right now if you have a heart attack outside of the hospital, your odds of surviving are not very good. And even if you have it in the hospital, they're not very good. And the damage to it, the brain just can't go really more than 5 minutes. But if you had some synthetic blood that allowed the oxygen transport and the related things, many proposals for that, then maybe you could sit on the bottom of a swimming pool for a couple, 3 hours and survive at least those kinds of catastrophes.
Right.
By the way, in the novel, you explore how things go wrong in a book like that. What happens is some young kids have it, and this is an end of the world. It's a very tough scenario. A warning if you're going to read that. And it's what I call a zombie death, because it's one thing to die in a hospital. It's very different when this happens outdoors, and it can take all too long for that to happen. But if you could change that, improve your vascular tree, lots of people proposing different therapeutics to do that now. But the real thing is going to be take some of Ian's genes on his heart, grow a separate heart over here, and transplant it, or maybe better, with some kind of gene replacement therapy, is work out the genes we want for your new improved heart, and then you sniff something in a canister with maybe a lot of hollowed-out viruses that have the new genome, just the part modified, though, for your new heart. And maybe then as your heart cells start to replicate every few months, that they replicate, creating the newer, improved Ian heart cells than the old ones. Right. And without even realizing it, you wake up a year later and you've got a new heart. Now, if you can do something like that with gene replacement therapy, you're going to go a lot better than 120 years.
That doesn't seem that expensive, though, that doesn't seem like it would be only the realm of a billionaire.
That's right. Just like I had a phone malfunction. I'm speaking on a new Apple phone right now. It was an AR-14 chip and an incredible processor chip. I mean, this sort of thing would have been inconceivable even 30 years ago. And you would think it would have been in the realm of a billionaire, and it would have been a chip the size of this room I'm in right now versus something that fits handily inside of a wallet. So I think this will be quite affordable. And I think as the prospect of this occurs, there are many problems, and we can get to those. But one benefit, and I think it's an important one, with the prospect of a longer life for everybody, not just the rich guys, and they will be first. And I know a lot of them are working on this very hard right now. But one benefit is we won't treat the planet like a rental car, which is what I think we all tend to do. I mean, after all, most people don't even have a will, and a denial of death and a short death and, oh, what's it matter? I'm dying anyway sort of thing. If you think you're going to have a reasonable shot at 200-300 years without having to come back to a resurrection process, I think you're going to be a little more responsible. And we're dumping millions of tons of plastic into the ocean each year, which I think is a more immediate threat than global warming, which is itself a threat. And there's so many others that we do that I think is because of our old Darwinian time horizon. We're going to expand that.
So this makes a great argument for sustainability, obviously. Yes. And you hint at something which I want to get to next then, largely discredited, social Darwinism, which was used for horrible justifications. But let's talk about the haves and the have-nots. If you're going to have a society where only the rich can afford this type of treatment, what would that be like? And then I'll wonder whether it's like for Japan. What if somebody like in Japan, they just decided everybody gets this? What happens to the balance of nature when some countries who already have large populations have large populations that never get old? Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. So we're talking with Dr. Bart Kosko about a couple aspects of immortality as a result of various speculations that would suggest that there are new ways, some technical, some digital, some physical. Some of these could be sooner than later, but the concept is that with enough money, billionaires could buy themselves a couple extra 100 years on the planet. That science is just not that far out of reach. It doesn't have to be a case where only their head is preserved in some fluid somewhere or something and floating, and you can ask it questions and it can give you answers. I mean, it could just literally be that somebody never dies, and that, in fact, aging could be reversed. I was asking Dr. Bart Kosko about whether or not we're even using the right vocabulary, right? I mean, when we say what we're talking about, do we mean we're curing death? Are we delaying death? Is this some sort of second life? I mean, how do we even talk about that? And we'll get into a little bit more of that when we talk about the societal impact of this. I mean, we're already in a place where we're having discussions for which there's no legal infrastructure. There's no social understanding of the implications of this. It's just going to move forward because somebody has enough money to make it so, and no one's going to be there to stop them. So it's got a little bit like shades of Frankenstein, right? There's nothing that stopped Frankenstein from creating a monster, so to speak. And for that matter, there's this larger discussion about whether or not the quote-unquote monster, did it really have a soul? Was it... if we were able to tie together people and then shoot enough electricity into them, do they lose some sort of divine spark? Are they automatons? I mean, there really are some interesting conversations to be had on this. But the ones I want to get to are more in the area of social Darwinism, and we'll get back to that coming up in just a second. All right, so, Bart, let's start there. So, as we left it there, I was kind of thinking about this from a social standpoint. If we're going to enter into one of the most difficult societies to maintain is one of severe haves and have-nots. So if you have a billionaire class that can live to be forever, and they have to by definition, they'll have to structure their money. But as you say, it can be done so that as they grow older, their resources will grow with them. But you'll also have all of these other people who won't be able to afford to do that if it's done purely on a monetary basis. So then you've got that problem for potential societal unrest. And then you have a case like maybe a country like Japan, which already has the highest average lifespan on the planet, that if the Japanese said, look, we love this technology, but everybody gets it, so that all of Japan will grow old together, and everybody, because we value wisdom, we value our elders, so we're going to let everybody grow to be 200 years old. Somewhere, I think there's going to be some destabilization for peace, war, resources, fights over water, food. Where are you with that?
It's the right question, and two things. The moral side, which in turn gives birth to, second, the legal. I think the big moral principle for the wealthy is to stay out of politics. And I know they don't want to do that, not all wealthy people. I've known a few wealthy people, and we've certainly seen them. And my eye is on right now the gathering that will take place in Davos, Switzerland on Monday, I believe, the so-called World Economic Forum, with Dr. Klaus Schwab and a whole bunch of other billionaires who have come together in a kind of a corporate oligarchy with proposals to run the world purportedly for own benefit. I mean, I think they're crossing a lot of lines there, and it raises that issue. So number one, not that anyone cares what I say, but my advice to any is stay out of politics. Even if you're a $100 billionaire plus, like Mr. Bezos, don't just shell out $250 million for the Washington Post unless you put it into a blind trust just to help the struggling journalists of the world, which would be great. That's not, I think, what's going on there. And so when they do that, the problem here in the scope of the market system and others, which I'm a big fan of, is what we call the boundary conditions. And I would use the physics analogy of a drum head. Most of the time we think of a drum, we think of the skin head. I mean, skin head literally comes from the skin of animals and now synthetic skins vibrating. But we do have a boundary condition where we pinch it down to zero. There's a famous equation known as the Bessel equation for doing it. And by the way, I had one of my mentors was the great probability theorist Mark Kotz, and he asked that famous question, can you hear the shape of a drum? They're still trying to answer that. But in any event, the boundary conditions, if you change a system that changes in time, we call them a dynamical system. You change the boundary conditions, you'll change it. And what you're talking about are these boundary conditions hitting limits of resources. I gave you the number the last hour of how quickly even S&P 500 compounding at 10% a year blows up after a few hundred years. And so, I mean, there wouldn't be a stock market around. There wouldn't be those kind of assets to allocate. But long before that happened, you would have major distortion between the haves and the have-nots. And maybe just as an old kid from Kansas here, I see America, for example, as a model of the world, as a middle-class society, a middle class that's being eroded because of problems with education and drugs and inflation and a bunch of other things, and separating out, as so many countries have, and I think most really have, if you look at the last 10,000 years, into the very rich and powerful and everybody else taking orders beneath them. Then I look at the World Economic Forum, and man, it sure sounds like that. So number one, you're dead on this. We have enough wealth inequality. We exacerbated it since the financial collapse of 2008, where we allowed a lot of big banks to gamble and get private benefits and to socialize the costs. I don't know any ethical theory that allows that. And so far as I can tell from the derivatives market and elsewhere, we're just as leveraged up now, if not more, than we were back then. But we've had so much excess money, which has been great for people who own stocks and real estate, but not for the average person. And even it can greatly accelerate beyond it. So what to do? What level? One thing, a term I would use, and this is not in any book that I'm aware of, instead of an inheritance tax, I think we're going to have to look at some point, if this gets out of hand, if the wealthy want to continue to interfere with politics, Dr. Schwab, then we need what I would call a self-inheritance tax. In other words, if the average lifespan, functional lifespan, was really 60 years, then if you lived 120, it's really like 2 lives there. And the real problems take place not just with inherited wealth, but the compounding effects that we really were not, in a Darwinian sense, engineered for. Again, relatively short lives. Right. So we'd have to do something like that. And otherwise, we'll end up with those who get there first, have the benefits of compounding, will take up much of the world's resources. I mean, look at right now the purchase of farmland by the wealthy in this country. There was an article recently in the Washington Post. It's stunning to see a lot of dot-com billionaire types have purchased a lot of land. It's hard to square that with an Adam Smith theory or a Ronald Coase theory of efficient allocation, let alone moral allocation. So at some point, and I just think human nature is so competitive. We are so obsessed with status. If you really boil this down, as the great writer and PhD sociologist Tom Wolfe used to make clear in so many ways, we're so obsessed with status that I just don't think the wealthy can resist this. And they're really asking for a pitchfork kind of revolt here. A minimum would be something like this self-inheritance tax to limit the effects of compounding.
Well, then you have a situation where then even if you bought a lot of land, then you'd have to protect a lot of land, which would mean probably some sort of not just a security firm, but some kind of private army. If we're looking at numbers that would prevent a kind of revolt where 90% of the population, 98% of the population couldn't afford what the luxuries were going to be of that 2%, there's no telling how many people it would take to overrun a compound like that. Or for that matter, how many Brutuses would live within an organization, right? And does they just be internal and turn on the
I think king? The wealthy right now have small private armies. They're going to have more. Another way to look at this, though, and we are assuming that we stay on the planet Earth. Like if we just look at plate tectonics, we know things are going to go bad at some point in the future, and we've got all kind of things arriving from outer space. So we have to have a backup, not just on the moon. And there have been various theories on this, that we move out more and more to outer space. Things like 3D printing make that more feasible than you might think. Sure. And likewise, whatever the merits and demerits of solar power, it's kind of tough here on Earth, but it's really good out in space. And you'll see a lot more of that. So maybe if we do kind of take up the land here and use and abuse, we're poisoning the ocean. I'm more worried right now about plastics and heavy metals than anything else. And precisely because it's, quote, unquote, commonly owned or not owned at all. But I discuss this in my book called Heaven in a Chip. But if we have this nanotech future, I'm not saying that we will, but if we do, where we move out into space and build lots of spheres out of diamond and people live in them and some kind of harmony, then maybe that would be a kind of good prod or incentive to get people out there. But I wouldn't bank on it. And right now, I think we have to assume as the old saying is, invest in real estate because God's not making any more of it. And I think that's what we'd be looking at. And you've seen what's happened to the price of land. Right. And it doesn't look to be changing anytime soon.
But what would happen, too, with the prospects of immortality in space when the physical demands on the human body change? We don't have any long-term data on that. We have short-term data of people going into space and being measured on bone density and
it's not good.
Well, so let's talk about that. So what would it be like, though, if we colonized the moon? Would we be reducing lifespan, or would we be increasing it if we were living in a different atmosphere?
Well, right now, just going to Mars looks like it'd be fatal from a radiation point of view. Now, we can create radiation shielding. We're working on that kind of thing. Lifelong. I mean, it's tough enough just being an astronaut in a space station, my understanding, in terms of the effects of that. But I think there's a different path here, and I think it happens pretty quickly. And it's something I wrote about in the 90s in my novel, Nanotime. I mentioned to you before, this began as an effort, the phone call from the great writer-director Oliver Stone to make a movie to compete with Stanley Kubrick's, at the time, movie AI. In any event, I tell the story of that in the digital release. You can read that for free online. But nanotime is a term that I coined, that once you have even a little bit of chip backup in the brain, we're going to have a lot of that, let alone an outright replacement. Why? Because the fundamental flaw of the brain is it has no backup. So we'll back it up. Just the National Academy of Engineering has made reverse engineering the brain a goal for the 21st century. I'm quite confident we'll achieve that. And once that happens, everything changes. So in nanotime, when you're dealing with a much more rapid flow of information than what's flowing through your nerves now. Remember, your nerves are based on, in effect, salt coming out of the ancient oceans, ions. That's how you get the electricity to move something from the thought in your head to moving your big toe and back again. And we didn't figure that out. There was even electricity till 1770 and the like. But once you have chip kinds of flows and now photonic flows, which are even faster, much more impressive. And I should point out the difference between an electron and a photon at this level. Electrons, called fermions, they interfere with each other when they get near it, they repel. Whereas photons don't have the effect. They're bosons. They can pass through one another without interference. And it leads to very different kinds of computing that are underway right now. And in any event, what happens is you're nanotime, so you're thinking a billion times or more faster. So a few seconds of our slow meet time now could be years, century, maybe more, depending upon the speed of the medium. So in that sense, Ian, you get a kind of approximation, maybe not of eternity, but of a very long life, and what would otherwise just be a year on Earth. And the like, and if somebody's hanging out in a bubble in space, it may be in a different form, in more of a digital form. And you mentioned cryonic suspension before. That's just a very crude backup for those of us born too early have to do to back up our synapses before we're able to transfer them, so-called upload them, to a chip, where you'll be in nanotime.
Well, and this could be the perfect time to bring up then the other aspect of this conversation, which would be a kind of digital immortality. There's already crude versions of this out there where you could create a hologram of a person, and that person could have the voice of the avatar, or the avatar could have the voice of the human that it is modeling. They could have some expressions. They could, you could create, if you had enough data, if you had enough tapes, if you had enough whatever, you could create a digital version of somebody which could theoretically last forever. Well, where are you with that?
Well, I mentioned my novel Nanotime, and the novel has 4 dramatic characters. The main character, a selfish young man who kind of grows up spiritually and makes it to digital heaven by way of World War III. But his buddy is the great urbane English philosopher from the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, who he's reconstructed as an intelligent agent, precisely as you said. And in the end, I won't give away the book, but they get to merge in nanotime after the effects of World War III. So if you could have a recording, or in that case, I had just gotten tenure, and I was reading the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, one of my favorite philosophers, and I had the idea incorporating him into, and I recommend everyone read On Liberty. And in any event, I was doing that, and I could kind of emulate his voice, and so I peppered it with that. And today, with what are called generative models, and in particular adversarial neural networks, good and bad, deep fakes and those kinds of things, we're already there, Ian. So you could create, and I think it's maybe a good idea to do it of family members before we lose them, to have some kind of backup. Maybe your great-great-grandchildren would care to speak with you or some version of you, even if we don't have that kind of digital upload, just this sort of simulation you're talking about.
Right. Like before he got totally weird, Kanye West gave Kim Kardashian, right, a hologram of her late father. Kind of spendy, as a gift, whatever, but it was a hologram of her father, who had this, I don't know if you know, he was a seminal figure in radio for about, he died prematurely, but in the time that he was on the planet, he was very impactful. And so for her 40th birthday, she got that. And that was an interesting thing. That was just it's not quite, like they're doing that on CNN, obviously. They're doing some of these experiments where they do a hologram of one of the reporters as they're walking around a scene or something. But this was just somebody who'd already, died. There was they had to recreate, just like you're suggesting that your character did with John Stuart Mill. They had to recreate Kim Kardashian's dad. Yeah, that's at hand. Now, I see the way to do that, it's today called a GAN, or Generative Adversarial Model. It's actually a version of something called a curiosity network from a gentleman named Schmidhuber.
out of the University of Lugano in the 90s, but it's come roaring back. And there have all these great algorithms for years, Ian, but we didn't have the kind of computing power we have now. And like I said, the kind that's coming, especially because of the combination of light with electricity.
So again, though, that notion of the hologram, it was so expensive. I don't even know that I heard a final figure for what that would be, but it would take somebody like a Kim Kardashian or the wealth of a Kanye West to kind of do that. The average person wouldn't be able to do it. But we're also hanging out there something else I want to get to. And I want to get back to that conversation about Japan. And what if a global dominance strategy was just outliving everybody else, and instead of putting money in bombs and planes, they put it into this technology and just kept growing it, a population, until it could take over the planet just by growth. And then resources, too, back to that, too. I'm having so much fun with Dr. Bart Kosko. We're a half hour away from your questions and comments coming up on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Next hour is when we'll get to your calls for Dr. Bart Kosko. A lot to get to still, and so much so that I made a note. I kind of pinned it when we got sidetracked a little bit. But, there are so many different, we talked about Moore's Law earlier and all of that. Very cool. But there's the law of unintended consequences. What could possibly go wrong kind of a response that we should be having a lot when it comes to science that's kind of allowed to go untethered. And this isn't Dr. Bart Kosko's argument, by the way. He's not suggesting that all of this should go unchecked. He's just saying this is in his prediction. There will be that science will be punching above its weight, if you will, long before society can catch up. And who knows what could happen in the meantime when it comes to immortality. Before we get to your participation, we'll finish up ours on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Bart, whether we're talking about digital immortality and the technology around that, which isn't the same, obviously, as physical immortality, but whether we're talking about, a death cure or just for the ego stroke of feeling like everybody will have known our name or can interface with our brilliance for decades to come, I keep coming back to, I feel like I'm missing something. There's a big piece of this, which legislation aside, or even the finances aside, where I just keep thinking, where's the horror movie in this? Where's that moment? Really, where's that moment where we go like, oh, didn't see that coming?
Let me say that last time I was with you, I mentioned that old Woody Allen joke that Hollywood is high school plus money, and
right.
My take was that modern social media was high school plus the KGB. We now know through the Twitter files that was way too close to the truth. Social media, so far as at least at Twitter, turns out to be high school plus the FBI. I didn't think we saw that coming. So imagine as we back up more of ourselves, the computer chips, the invasions due to hackers, political manipulations, and just what cancel culture will look like when it captures our chips, Ian. That, to me, will be a bigger problem.
I think this idea of cancer culture, I think it's playing out. And I think it is an obsession with Gen Z, but I don't think Gen Alpha is going to buy into it the same way. And I think we're getting to a point where we see diminished returns on canceling people. And for a while, it was like a power move, and it was sort of like, hold my beer. I think there was kind of a generational sense of we'll show them. But I also already think that maybe that's kind of turning the corner. I'm not.
Ian, I wish you were right. Let me give you, unfortunately, a counterexample.
Go ahead.
And the buzzword is AI fairness in AI. Now, the game has been, as you know, in our turmoil times, is to try to change or win arguments by changing the language, whatever it happens to be. We've seen a lot of that within 2 years, and I'm sure we'll see more. So I have colleagues who work in this, and I want to point out also just some inside baseball. The word AI reflects an approach to machine learning that comes out of computer science. And my field, we like to think is a little more rigorous, electrical engineering and physics. We call it now CI, or computational intelligence. I mean, no one really knows what the I is, the noun of intelligence, but it doesn't help to add an adjective like artificial, at least computational intelligence. So just be aware of that. And one of the efforts coming out of my friends in computer science who've been very good with language, picking, instead of calling things adaptive control, calling it robotics, but essentially the same thing, is this so-called fairness in AI. And I asked someone, I said, isn't fairness just equal treatment? Well, yeah, kind of. So if it's not that, what is it you mean? So what I can see going on here is an attempt to manipulate the algorithms at the deepest level, and ultimately the hardware that instantiate those algorithms, to say this is fair and this is not. And I think it's back to that Darwinian status thing, some people having power over others, and it'll be a form of cancellation. And, for example, we mentioned John Stuart Mill, cite to a wonderful article that just appeared from law professor Jonathan Turley at George Washington University. It just appeared in the Harvard Law Review.
Right.
I think get off of Turley's website. And it's about the corruption of Mill's argument. What was Mill's argument on liberty? That the only basis, he said, for collectively using force against somebody is to prevent harm from others. Their own good is not enough. This is the classic Millian argument, and much of the United States Constitution reflects that. Well, a lot of the people playing the cancellation game have said, wait a minute, every time you make a joke, Ian, it offends me. And if I get to say what the magnitude of offense, the law so far doesn't do this, but people want it to change, then, hey, I can turn Mill's argument on its head, and we have to control your speech because it may offend me or it may offend someone else. And I don't mean just categories based on race or religion, but who knows what it would be. So this is a growing problem, and there's a great race right now taking place in the computer science world to, so far as I can tell, to incorporate values. The word is alignment, so that the values align with what somebody, often a Gen Xer, thinks is fair. And there's a lot of cancellation in that.
You meant Gen Z, I think, because nobody pays attention to Gen Xers. So I think you meant,
they are, I'm not so sure on those terms. But,
no, it's true. Gen Z.
I know, because I teach a lot of them,
right?
And I teach PhDs in CS and E, and I'm the guy who gives them their screening exams and probabilities.
Right.
So I have a sense of this. And in any event, it's alive and well at that level.
Oh, well, listen, I mean, I'm with you in part of that, because I think this is like any university professor. There has been a movement away from the traditional Socratic methods or the kind of classic Greek structure of passing along information. You give me a certain amount of money and I'll give you a certain amount of knowledge. There isn't that is gone. And it may never get back to that. But that to me isn't the real issue. I think that I'm always not surprised. Let me say that again. I'm always not surprised when the things which people predict were a certainty and they're going to say this is absolutely how badly this is going to end are wrong. And part of that is because it may start that way, but trajectories are unpredictable. And one of those, aside from the traditional concept that it is the obligation of every generation to shock the generation that comes before it.
Right.
After we go through that, then there still has to be a certain time where someone's going to have to take out the garbage, and somebody's going to have to come by and pick up the garbage. And there's like certain realities of communal living that are still going to be decided, and somebody's going to monetize it and whatever. But I think this idea of cancel culture will be much more reserved. It'll be less of a weapon. It will still, and this is where you and I live it, it's still going to be true on college campuses because that's a petri dish, right? But out in the world, it doesn't function well. It doesn't really, there are all those internet anonymous randos out there that are always trying to stir trouble because that's what they do and they feel like it. But beyond that, I mean, responsible people, I think, will see a greater return on this. And I give you as examples of that a lot of the predictions of millennials and these kids today and whatever didn't turn out to be true. And the same thing with...
I understand that, but
right?
I look in my adopted state of California. We have legislation that Governor Newsom recently signed that it's almost certainly unconstitutional, but they passed it. It's a one-party state, and the legislation says that physicians, in effect, can have their licenses revoked if they're saying the wrong things about COVID. Right. No one ever heard of such a thing, interfering between the doctor and the patient, and this. But so maybe downstream it's going to lessen somewhat, but my deeper concern is human nature. And human nature is a Darwinian struggle of the worst kind, and it's about status. And for those that get power over others, whether it's through how their looks or how they talk or how they tell a joke or how big their wallet is, and I think it'll be irresistible to control, to manipulate information you can see. I hope we can stop it. We see it being institutionalized right now in China and the social credit system. And what I hear I come back to the World Economic Forum, sure sounds like an attempt to add a worldwide social credit system, scoring system. So I think this is being built maybe again in some cruder ways of shouting down people who say something at a lecture. I think that hopefully will be fading. But at the level worldwide of controlling the flow of bits here, I think going the direction. It could be very difficult to undo that.
Well, I don't know that if I would challenge the notion that this is new anyway. I mean, you look at the number of people who are hanged, electrocuted, imprisoned for life for ideas that they expressed. Isn't that old? Sacco and Vanzetti, people that didn't actually commit crimes or committed lesser versions of the crimes that they were later convicted of. And it served the interests of some people who were very powerful to send a message to these immigrant classes or to whomever that you don't have the power here, we do, and here, let's show it to you, and we'll put it in the front page of every paper. So, I mean, I do think that this may be a little topsy-turvy version of the previous power structure, but it's not new. I mean,
No, it's not new at all.
Yeah, I mean, and I get the intellectual apartheid that you're talking about, but is it any different than the apartheid, the actual apartheid that existed in slavery, for example?
Has happened. The amount of self-censoring, I think, in people is extraordinary, and that's the sort of thing that what we call, as you know, free speech law, we call the effective chilling of speech. It's getting ice cold out there on a lot of topics. It's just not worth your while to go there. It's not a healthy thing for democracy, for human nature. I
agree.
And I have a lot of colleagues who are getting up in the years, but who either fled or defected from the Soviet Union. And they tell me they feel this is just all too reminiscent of the life. My wife fled communism, by the way, when she was very young. That, whatever kind, there aren't many Spielberg movies to turn to for the youngins to understand what communism means. But it largely came down to a group of intellectuals who knew better, where the means justified the end. The latest line, recasting that, is so-called effective altruism or something like that. But it's the means justifying the end. And so they were able to do that, enforced by media, and no one particular person would stand up because the system would crush them. We're seeing that implemented right now in China. I mean, again, so far as we know, there are 1 million Uyghurs living in quasi-concentration camps in China.
Just awful.
We watched our friends in Hong Kong just 2 years ago. They're gone now, those protests. We didn't want to think about that. So the ability we're seeing it unmasked, I think, thanks to Elon Musk's $44 billion purchase of Twitter, a little bit of that, and a really disturbing silence from the media on this.
Okay, wait. But wait a second. Let's remember, there was the same agreement that was made between, Paley and the FBI. Right? There were all these different agreements between the heads of media that owned the oligarchy who owned. I mean, Twitter is a fairly innocuous version of this. I mean, Twitter is not that impactful. But there was a time when there were very few media companies in the United States, and they were fully colluding with the U.S. government. And that's a matter of historical record. You wouldn't dispute that.
No, my point was, during that time, what I looked up to what are called liberals, I mean that in the broadest sense of what.
No, I understand. Right.
We're opposed to it. And today, I have a lot of, and they're just silent. They're afraid to speak out. And it's a problem. I hope you're right. I'm just maybe it comes with age. You're a little too pessimistic about it.
No, well, and
yeah.
And I say I never try to let cynicism pass for wisdom. It's been a philosophy of mine since I was very young, and because there's always somebody who's willing to tell me, "Oh, this will never get better," or "This will never be," and it's sort of part of my Christian optimism. I think probably that's just in my DNA that I just think, well, maybe we can do a little better. But I'm with you in the sense of we feel that pushback and that sense of control, that intellectual control that says, better not say that. And that's not good for anybody in the long run. But we also see historically pendulum swings. And I just wonder what the pendulum swing might come as a result of this. Instead of thinking it's just going to continue to go in one direction, some things have a way of
Christianity. If I look in the East, I see the Buddha, and the West, Jesus. There's many other figures. But one of the great things about those two leaders is a kind of pure unselfishness, a kind of altruism. And it's so contrary to our nature, and we all have huge blind spots. We're all much more selfish than we care to admit. And it's such an extraordinary thing that we build entire institutions around them. But that deep, dark Darwinian thing that got built into us literally eons ago. Again, modern civilization, 10,000 years, nearly 500 generations, a drop in the Darwinian bucket. I'm very concerned about the transfer, the extent that Darwinian class obsession and competition, not just among males, transfers over to a digital technology and the fight for things like even approximate immortality and the like. And we've come up with systems like the market that sort of harnesses that in a constructive way. Sports, I think, that's why we have sports and the like. But we're about to transition to this digital age I've mentioned before. Just if we take the old law of privacy as an example, it was set up by these kinds of John Stuart Mill liberals to protect that, and we just didn't think about the effect of, well, if you set some of your documents, your bank statements out in the trash, you've abandoned them. We never thought that the courts would look at that and say, hey, every time you send an email, you've abandoned that email. And we're going to call that the third-party doctrine, and the government and other parties don't need to get a search warrant. And
they can look at it, right?
Yeah, and we're still stuck with that right now. In fact, that has a lot to do, I think, with what happened at Twitter and probably at Facebook and the other social media companies.
Well, and I endorse that, and I think you're saying exactly how I feel, and there are lots of things about that we should all be very mindful of this, because if it takes root and it inculcates and we can't ever separate it out from society, that's one thing. But I can't tell you how many times I'm watching actual elected officials, I mean, people who should know the Constitution, who intentionally mislead people about Twitter and say that somehow Twitter is violating somebody's constitutional rights of free speech. Well, that does not exist. And you know it. I know it.
That's technically true in terms of the First Amendment. But let me give you some pushback on that. And I refer to Justice Clarence Thomas. And his famous concurrence just about 2 years ago called the Knights of Columbus. And it had to do with tweeting involving former President Trump, and the case was dismissed in effect. And he was explaining in his multi-page concurrence that there are many other doctrines, though, that we have, besides just straight-up free speech, private versus state action. I understand that. But besides also deputizing private actors, which happens when the FBI works with them, which seems to have happened in Twitter. But besides that, we just have what's called the common carrier doctrine. That's been around at least since the telegraph structure in the 19th century. And it's why when you're talking on the phone, the phone company can't intercede and shut you down, say, okay, I didn't like what you just said.
Right.
That sort of thing. And so those kinds of doctrines do allow, and there's accomplice liability, there's a whole variety of, and Justice Thomas was clearly saying, send me a case, guys. And I've heard to the legal grapevine, there's a couple, three of them working their way up to the Supreme Court. So I think you'll find it's not as simple as saying private company can do what it wants. That's actually not quite right. To first order, it's right. There's lots of exceptions to that. And there's also things that can take place in states versus federal. But just the common carrier doctrine alone, I think you're going to see that change. The other thing that's going to happen, I think, is just judicial reinterpretation of the few words involved in the key component of Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act and things like that, but just how you interpret certain words.
Yeah.
can make all the difference. But the net effect is it's not going to be enough, I think, just to say private company, therefore anything goes.
Well, it's not a matter of anything goes. What it's we're not confusing the notion that if you started a company tomorrow and you didn't put on your website what I want you to put on your website, that you've denied my right to free speech. And I think this is where a lot of this conversation ultimately comes back down to is we want those protections for the things for the speech that we like. And that brings me back to John Stuart Mill. We all have to be more worried about protecting the speech we don't like if we want to live in a free society. So we'll put that on hold now, but it'll no doubt come back up again next hour. Coast to Coast AM. So, this is Ian Punnett. Heading into this hour, here our last hour on Coast to Coast, and woo, zoom, the show has just flown by. I hope our guest feels the same way, Dr. Bart Kosko. We'll get to your questions and comments about immortality, about the physical immortality, which it seems like billionaires will be the first in line to get, and then the potential that other countries might present a different model for how that technology could be used. And then there's the digital immortality of holograms and making a computerized version of us that will live on forever for those who can afford that. And I'm not saying there's nothing against capitalism, just saying that's what's going to drive this research. But what happens when it becomes non-proprietary and people can access that? Well, maybe that's the devil in the details that we haven't quite figured out yet. We'll get back to that. We'll get to your questions and comments too on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. I know we're going to have a ton of people who are going to want to jump in, Bart, so I don't want to take more than a minute or two to cap what we were just talking about before the top of the hour. But I will express this as part of my optimism, or perhaps my ongoing understanding of how things change in unexpected ways. I never thought that the conservatism to which I had always been drawn would turn into, in so many cases, this kind of postmodern deconstructionalism where everything is challenged as whether or not it's real. I mean, there are times I'm watching Sean Hannity, and I think I might as well be watching Baudrillard talking about simulacra. I can look at an image, and he's saying that's not actually what the image tells you it is. And I'm thinking that's so pervasive with every group, every identity group, that we there is no central truth anymore. There's no central story in our country. And I think that's part of what bonds any nation together, is that we have a central understanding of our mission and our future and what we're about. And I don't think it exists anywhere anymore. Where are you on that?
I feel that as well. Let me just say, I was born in a split household with a Republican father and a Democrat mother.
Exactly, me too.
I think I was destined to be a libertarian. By that, I just mean someone that believes in limited government.
Yep.
Broadly. And so what bothers me is I've never fit in quite well. I often say a libertarian politically is like a bat. When you put a bat next to a mammal, it looks like a bird. When you put a bat next to a bird, it looks like a mammal. And so there's always, but when I see the two parties, it's looking more and more to me like a Hatfield-McCoy set up. And that started off by a legal fight over a pig or something, if you go back and look at it. And I'm worried about that. And well, you said we don't have the common values. You have these endless games of tit for tat.
Right.
And meanwhile, the world's a very tough, competitive place. And I think, I miss the old days where we had a common agreement on the value of tolerance.
Right.
And the objective of liberty. I mean, those are two grand goals out of Western liberalism. It took 500 years of bloodshed, at least in merry old England, to achieve some of that. And I don't feel that tolerance like I did when we were younger. And we were worried about it.
And even your use of the word liberalism, of course, I know exactly what you mean by it, right? But you say that in the wrong crowd.
I know it.
You get punched in the face. And it's like, no.
Yeah, punched in the face, canceled and categorized, pigeonholed, and
But liberalism, the very concept of what our founding fathers believed in. I mean, it was the concept of that. If I
give you this image, one of my great teachers was the late, great Professor Lotfi-Zada, the fellow who introduced and named fuzzy logic, head of the E department at Berkeley. And last November 2021, Google had a Google Doodle based on fuzzy logic, and a picture of him and a figure from my Scientific American article. But Lotfi was such an interesting character. I never knew where he stood politically. And I would usually meet him internationally, often in Japan or wherever we were at conferences. We were very close. We'd speak all the time about this time of night after the Ted Koppel show. But when I'd meet him, he would always say to anybody around, and it isn't just technical people, come join us. Come sit with us. He usually didn't drink, but whatever it happened to be. And it was open, and he loved hearing other points of view, would always do the friendly devil's advocate, and I always felt I got something out of that. And I feel sorry for especially the youngsters who don't have that benefit of that open, true meeting of minds and letting a few sparks fly. Maybe
they're going to miss their chance of natural inoculation.
Yes.
Right? And so without being exposed to germs, if they live in a bubble, that's what's going to happen. And at the same time, on the other side of that, when we're talking about these immortality models, that's unnatural selection, if we're going to talk about Darwin, right?
Absolutely.
It's absolutely unnatural selection. And then is that ever going to be governed? Can it be? Should it be? I don't know. Cheryl is in Missouri. She gets to kick us off on Coast to Coast AM. Cheryl?
Hey, you two, I tell you what, this conversation is amazing. Thank you so much. It's so brain stimulating.
I'm hanging on for dear life, Cheryl. Hanging on by my fingernails.
Tell you what, this conversation, because this guy, I tell you what, Bart, you are intelligent, well-spoken, and you have a great, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm saying cool beans. Okay. Anyway.
Okay.
Excuse me.
You have a question, Cheryl? Did I talk to you last night on Open?
Yes, I was on Open Line.
Okay, all right.
I know.
Well, let's make some room for some other people. So do you have a quick question for Bart?
Yes, I do. In regards to this sort of matter with the stem cells, to get back to that point, when a woman births a child, and a lot of hospitals, the stem cell research right now, it's pretty hefty. They take the placenta. They take the umbilical cord, and that's that's gold in regards to stem cells. In addition, the tiniest people, like when they got one abortion, they have one child, kind of thing. That's stem cell, mother load. I was wondering, Bart, what do you think about a copyright here in the United States, where it's like if a hospital's going to collect those stem cells from the placenta and the umbilical cord, that they should, ask the mother, whether or not she wants to sign a genetic waiver.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay.
If it happens at all, it has to be through complete informed consent. I'm not sure it always happened. We had a problem with corneas on people who died. And by the way, China did rescind its one-child policy. And the research has been a little slower than we thought on stem cells, but it's still a very big deal. But absolutely nothing of yours. This is just ordinary property, not intellectual property. Nothing of yours given up without your consent.
Daniel's a first-time caller in Florida on Coast to Coast AM. Daniel?
Hi there, Ian. Hi. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your wisdom and your perspective and your well-versed area of conversation on so many topics. Yeah, and speaking to the eyes and corneas, I'm somebody that wonders about that. It's another long story, but I'm missing my eyes from a surgery and a huge tragic accident. That could be a whole show in its own self.
Yeah, really?
I appreciate. Yeah, well, and then what happens with bio-waste or what gets used, and that's an interesting thing, what you just hinted on there, which is totally separate. I appreciate last night, Jeff Beck tribute, Blow by Blow, all the songs from that album. He had a great interview on the BBC radio today that they did from 2010, and they did a tribute for that. His work with Tal Wilkenfeld, a virtuoso bassist back in the early 2000s, I think, and with Imogen Heap, some of the more modern things that he did.
Sure. What
a great soul. I mean, he just seems like such a gentleman.
Why can't he live forever? Why can't we keep Jeff Beck alive forever? That's what I say.
come on, the freeway jam.
Yeah.
I learned so much more about him too, and we've ended as lovers. And
that's beautiful.
I just listened to that over and over and over on vinyl before moving away from where I am in Florida, until had that part where you wake up and your record's still spinning and the needles on that little center ring on the inside going click, click, click.
Right.
Just how many times. But I appreciate your guests. The number, I didn't know you were a 4-person and 44. I was born August 4th, 1980, and the number of 4 was a big thing. And you were 4 and 4. My number keeps coming up. I'd love to get the question about what's that meaning. Yeah. But my question for the guest tonight that you have there, the kind of fishbowl theory is the way I look at it, with living forever and what it is you need. Like, it doesn't matter if you can hold your breath forever in the fish pond, and like with how many fish can only be in a certain fishbowl. And we're already reaching sustainability limits on fish oil for consumption nutritionally as well, and other ingredients, vital ingredients, aside from the halogens being added into our food because they preserve food longer, or they condition the dough better or whatever since 1980. The things are added into the breads and for purification of water and other things. Well, what about the people that can afford to live forever? They're going to need to bring a team with them. What's to say that I think we should cut back and wonder about the sustainability of what we have for nutrition, and why as we get older and we get into nursing homes and we go on Social Security, and the amount of money left over from the system of people needing to die instead of living to like 130, that's twice a life, what Ian was saying earlier. Well,
let's get Bart on that. Bart, nutrition and a team, like every person who's going to do that at some point, like how do you manage with all of these limited resources, especially if even with the limits of sustainability on things like fish oil or other things which we kind of take for granted now?
We do take that for granted. We're having a problem with our overfished and over-polluted oceans, for example. And again, what we're talking about is not just growing old and doing it in an old folks' home, but growing old and being effectively young. Real fast, one of the dominant theories of aging is that every time your cells copy, there's some DNA breaks that don't get fully repaired. And as you age, that gets worse, partly because you don't have enough what's called NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And there are supplements you can take right now. I'm not recommending them. I do take them under doctors' supervision. But anyway, the point is, if you could just improve that, or even go back to a set point, or that a system restore point of your DNA, so that you could have, as you probably don't have, a sample of what your DNA was like when you were 18, that's the sort of thing that can keep you along for a long time. But it won't get around the problem you raised of not enough fish in the pond and too many people trying to fish in it. It's a tough problem, and it raises this population biology question: what is the carrying capacity of the planet? And it's a famous equation in mathematics, and it usually comes up in interaction terms. People argue it's only 1 billion. Maybe it's actually, with high efficiency, 20, 30, 50 billion. We don't know, but we're growing at such a rate. As I mentioned, it took a long time, 10,000 years, to get to the first 1 billion people alive at once. That was about 1805. By the time Ian and I were born in 1960, it was 3 billion. Now it's almost 9 billion. How many times do we keep doubling that? But one prospect is, for a longer life, is maybe pulling back on that throttle of having children so fast. You may still have them, but maybe not as much as you are when you're faced with a tighter, more compressed mortality. Other than that, it's going to be tough. And the energy constraints are bad, and, we can go out into space, and there's various schemes, one tested recently by the Naval Research Labs, of using solar-gathered energy and then shooting it down through microwaves. It's got all kinds of problems. But if we don't do that, and at the rate at which we're multiplying on the planet, and I'm not talking global warming, which is a separate issue and much more of a slow-motion issue, it's a real question, and then you get this fight between the haves and the have-nots that can be intensified.
Yeah. But what about the concept of amusing ourselves to death, in the sense that we've already seen that with all of this entertainment that we have available to us, and that we don't resist it any better than we resist foods that aren't good for us. And intellectually, we get stuck in things, and we're not very disciplined in the way in which we approach socially speaking. And we know this because of, marriage rates are down and birth rates are down and other things are happening in certain sectors of society because we're just you got so many things to distract you. And maybe that is going to be sort of, we use the Jurassic Park model, right? The Dr. Ian Malcolm model, and
yes.
that nature will find a way, that somehow nature will rebalance this, and that's what will stop us. Even if we have immortality, that's what is going to eventually will curb our growth or our appetites.
It is a problem, the distraction, and you're a professor, and you know this. The students,
say it.
I'm sure you have a policy on smartphones.
Go ahead and say it.
But let me tell you what advice I give to our instructors, and I oversee our many courses in probability and related things, but also other instructors. And 3 pieces of advice, but 2 of them. The first one is I picked up when I briefly studied a little bit of conducting as a kid, and I was in music, and that is this. Keep in your notes in your head, not your head in the notes.
Right.
They're not paying you to read from the play Hamlet. They're paying for the performance. And so that forces at least you, the instructor, to pack all that into cortex. And we need more of that. And the goal of teaching is to kind of get that into the student's cortex. Number 2, get it all on one page. But I find that students resist a certain memory constraint, and I come up with a variety of acronyms. I mentioned one on the show before I'm very proud of. My sole contribution to electromagnetics is the acronym FANG, F-A-N-G, for the 4 laws of the Maxwell's equations, electromagnetics, Faraday's law, Ampere's law, no magnetic monopoles, and Gauss's law, and things like that. Once you have that, you can achieve what psychologists call automaticity, or like the chess expert has maybe 30, 40 chess openings burned into memory, not looking them up, not Googling for them, that kind of shallow knowledge that doesn't stick. You need a lot of that, and it's much tougher, I've found over the years, to convey that to students when you're interrupted, when they're Googling. And I say to them at the beginning of the class, we want to have, like in contract law, a meeting of minds, not a meeting of smartphones.
Yeah. And that, unfortunately, I have a very strict policy on phones. Good. I do allow laptops because that's what they take notes on, but no social media during course and I walk around a lot in class. And I will, and very politely say, hey, I think you need to take that call outside. And I've seen people texting, whatever. I go, I think the hallway is a better place for that, but that's not a very popular thing to do, as you know. All right, so we've got time. I think we get one more person in before the bottom of the hour. Let's go to Brendan on a wild card line in Austin, Texas on Coast to Coast. Brendan?
Hey, thanks so much. I'll be super quick, Ian. Dr. Kosko, this is an awesome show, Art Bell-esque thing, and I got to say super quick because we're on Coast to Coast. In 2014, I got an ET download that told me this exact same stuff. It was really emotional. So, Dr. Kosko, there's some ET that have your back out there. The thing that I have to say is that births may decline if people never die. Obviously that's going to be a problem. And biological evolution is going to cease when that happens. And bacteria, their advantage is that they have a small lifespan and they can evolve quickly because they have diversity. Well, if a disaster happens and we don't have a high quantity of youth that has diversity, then that's going to lead to a higher chances of us being an extinction event. And that we had a nanotech guest that came on recently, and he said that drastic gene modification is likely to backfire and that we're probably just going to make it worse if we try to do anything. So my question is that how do you think that that's going to influence the biological evolution, and do you think that we're giving up something before, our humanity and biology, before we even fully understand what it is?
Yes, all those, and I think biological evolution essentially stops when we transfer to the ability to program our own genomes, as I mentioned about an hour ago. And I think the other point you raised is excellent, that the first attempts at anything in engineering, and that's bioengineering, are usually pretty bad. And we don't drive the kind of cars we initially designed or any other device that we have. It'll take many copies, and when you're playing around something as sensitive as the genome, it's truly uncharted territory. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. Just the CRISPR technology has started that in motion. We're going to have to deal with it, and hopefully in some more thoughtful ways. But the potential downsides are terrific.
Dr. Bart Kosko will continue for one more half hour on Coast to Coast. We will get your questions, your comments, as many as we can. Please keep them short so we can get everybody in before the end of the show on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Hey, Bart, pardon me for not knowing this, but do you do a podcast?
No, I don't.
We should talk. All right. People are loving this, and I'm so grateful. What a great response on Twitter, too, which is interesting to me. Let me go to, I guess we could pick up in about 5 different places. As long as everybody promises to kind of keep their questions or comments short, we can start with, let's start with Josh in Florida on Coast to Coast AM. Josh?
Hey, guys, great topic. So just had a question and a comment real quick, and I'll listen off air. I wanted to get the doctor's perspective on the future business of death and immortality. I almost feel like immortality is going to be, there's going to be like social media apps where AI and machine learning will be able to, aggregate somebody who's passed away, and they'll be living online, and kind of the future of that business model. And then my comment was with Twitter and other social media, you were talking earlier about cancel culture. The thing is when you advertise, they're taking your money and using your audience and analytics. I almost feel like there's something in like the Commerce Clause or something where
don't sign the agreement. Don't sign the agreement.
Well,
go to Mastodon. Go to Facebook. There's no law that says you have to be on Twitter.
No, they're taking your money.
Twitter's not taking your money.
And they're using your audience to make money. Like
I don't pay any money to Twitter. Well, they're not. So, I mean, I appreciate that, but it's a fool's errand to want to regulate Twitter, and any more than it makes sense to have gone in and tried to regulate the content of anything. It's not what the FCC was ever chartered to do. And if it's not the FCC, FCC is supposed to be the traffic cop, right? And when they got into this whole thing about content, it's just been a mess from the beginning. And so I just don't – I think we got to learn our lessons on private industry, and we can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, a private company shouldn't be forced to make a cake for a gay couple if they don't want it, but the government should be regulating Twitter. I don't know. I see that those two things not even – it's not even – I mean, Twitter is kind of doomed, I think. There's so many of the social media that we thought – or websites or search engines we thought would be around forever that are gone, So I just don't think they're that big a deal. It's sort of like the news networks, who now have a very small percentage of Americans who actually watch the news on network news anymore. But let's go back to that first point, Bart, and you can comment on anything you want, of course, but where are you with that?
Well, first off, he's right that Josh is right that the potential market here is huge for longevity. There's been a lot of patent battles where this tends to be fought. Right. And like the one example I mentioned before is the precursor to NAD+. NAD+, again, is in effect the way the body, and not just body, but plants, harvest. It's part of the process by which we harvest energy from electrons, ultimately courtesy of the sun. It's a very big deal, and as you age, it decreases. It also corrects DNA errors. And so the fight's been to restore that, and one precursor is called nicotinamide riboside. It's been the source of the focus of some intense battles that made the cover of Chemical Engineering News a while back, the size of the patent battles. And all these places have what we call patent thickets, very complex, big players involved, big investors. So it is a very big deal. And also to your point, though, Ian, I think you're right. Fundamentally, we want viewpoint neutrality from any kind of service. May not always be achievable. But what's caused the interest with the Twitter files, again, is the deputizing, apparently. We're going to find out more. The deputizing of private industry. So if I grab you in and find marijuana in your pocket and give it to a police officer, they can use that against you. That's admissible. But if the cops put me up to it, they've deputized me, they would need a search warrant. It would not be admissible otherwise. And that's the issue that we're seeing now.
Here's my challenge to you, Bud, is I'd love to see an article on John Stuart Mill on Twitter. What would be, as you like, and I'm all about John Stuart Mill, where would he be
I think the answer to that
Twitter
is, as I mentioned, came from the great Jonathan Turley. I read it recently. It's impressive. It's Harvard Law Review, and it's all about John Stuart Mill, primarily on liberty, which is what we're talking about.
Right.
But it's specifically about the effects in social media. It just appeared, and it's the premier law journal. So I would start with that.
Okay. I'll tell you a quick little trivia thing on Turley. So when he was in high school, he was a congressional page. Pretty common for somebody who has that type of aspirations. And the person who replaced him in that district as the congressional was my wife.
No kidding.
Turley was the guy before my wife, and then when he wrapped up his pageship, my wife came in. All right, so Anthony is in Louisiana on Coast to Coast AM. Anthony, you're talking with Dr. Bart Kosko.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. A quick comment and then another thought. Let's not forget that the Georgia Guidestones told us to live in balance with nature, a population of 500 million. And then they were destroyed last year, suspiciously. But anyways, I'm a waiter, right? And I was waiting on a congregation of a church. It was a pastor and three of his people. And he was talking about how now there are three Americas. And when y'all were talking about how divided we were, it made me think about the immortality concept and how we won't have a country to last forever if we don't get on the same page, right?
That's interesting.
So he said there's three Americas. He said there's July 4th, there's Juneteenth, and there's January 6th. And that kind of blew my mind. And there's this concept called oikophobia where you have your fear of your own home, and it's basically explaining that America has, now that we have the internet, the information age of wokeness, we've seen the dark underbelly of the way things run, and it's like we don't have that national pride you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I also see wokeness as like this whole new, the latest version of the satanic panic, of the moral panic thing. We see it over and over again. If you go back in every 5 or 6 years, it's a great way to generate income. It plays really well to the home districts, and politicians raise money off these things. And so it's actually called the mythical dragon model, where you create something which is so scary that only you can fix it, and that's a lot of our power is driven from that. Not to say that some of the wokeness thing isn't true, but these things tend to be like there will always be Satanists. But was it really a matter that there was underground tunnels and planes and trains that were moving children underground and all of that? But okay, yeah. So I like that oikophobia coming from the Greek for oikos, for house. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I could just say on the wokeness, and I hope that youngsters, again, can take a philosophy course from the old and get rattled.
Yeah.
And maybe not offended. I mean, you can control
good.
that. But you want to get rattled. I just tell a quick story. There was a professor that I trained under, and then he was a colleague at USC. It was Professor Dallas Willard. And a student came to me once and said, John, I'd like to take a philosophy class from him, but I'm a Catholic, and I hear he is the most rabid atheist on campus. And I said, well, I recommend you take the class from him. And by the way, he's a Baptist minister. He was so good, Dallas, and I recommend his writings. I loved him. Dallas was so good at debate and knowing the other side and keeping his position out of it that you would never know that but that's what was great about what we used to call the liberal education. It's always understood. Right. And you're missing something if you don't get that. Philosophy is not meant to reinforce your beliefs. No. It's meant to rattle you, and It's a good thing.
Yep, I agree 100%. Let me go to, let's see, Jeff is in Ohio on Coast to Coast AM, east of the Rockies. Jeff?
Hey, Bart, we've become American snowflakes. Listen, you were on to something earlier. I want to back you up a little bit on the show here. You were talking about Mars and radiation on the trip and so forth, and there's an awful lot of money, energy, and influence trying to go into putting a person up there. It isn't just about the radiation. It's about what you're going to live on the way. And my understanding is, and I've done the research on this and the homework, is that it's recycled urine and feces. There's no other way to do it. And here's the thing. If you get there without enough radiation shielding, you're going to die of radiation poisoning anyway. My problem with what's going on with Get to Mars is the money is being wasted because there's just no way we have the way to do this yet.
All right, Bart, where are you with that?
But we have taken a multi-decade pause. Ian, I remember from 1969, you and I thought that we would be vacationing on, if not Mars, at least on the moon. I think that's at some point we'll do it. It's true the startup costs are terrible at first, but thanks to gentlemen like Elon Musk and others, I think he speeded up the space effort by 10 years like he's done with electric cars. I think we'll get there. And by the way, the reason it's so bad with radiation is there's so many stars out there, and stars emit a lot of, ultimately, protons through hydrogen, and that is affecting you right now. When it hits the atmosphere, you get this whole cascade. But it's even dangerous if you spend too much time high up in an airplane. So by the time you get to the moon, the theory is we can go down beneath the surface or not earthquakes on the moon. We'll be able to do something there. But it's going to take a while. We really lost our momentum, and we had it back in the space race. But by the early 70s, I'm sure Ian remembers this, we all just got blasé about going to the moon, and it kind of went away.
Right. No, I agree with you. Chris is on a wild card line in Milwaukee on Coast to Coast. Chris?
Hey, Ian. Thanks for having me. I first of all, never thought I'd hear Baudrillard dropped on Coast to Coast.
Baudrillard,
awesome. Yeah. But,
my pleasure.
I'm just wondering if there's ever been any thought given to sort of like, if there's an upper threshold or just functionally for like what the human mind or brain can like process in terms of if we're immortal. So, I mean, obviously evolutionary, we're not designed to sort of last more than, 120 years at like an upper threshold. So once you start hitting 400, 500, 1,000 years.
Yeah, so it goes like this. The brain is 3 pounds of tissue, no bones. And we could ask what would happen if it were 50 pounds of tissue or 100 pounds. And there are estimates of that. There are quantum limits. And earlier Ian mentioned holograms. There's something known as the Van Heerden limit. And just to cut to the quick, what that means is information storage. You could store one bit of information, one on-off piece of information, in this minimal amount would be a little tiny, like sugar cube, where the length of the side of the cube would be that of one wavelength of light. And that really limits us to something like 10 to the 8 bits of information per cubic centimeter. And if you take that and just the processing of mass, we're limited. Quantum computing can speed that up somewhat because of parallelization, but we do have real limits to what we can do with ultimately digital transfers and the like, let alone immortality. So it's not infinite. Compared to where we are today, it might seem like that at first. But there are very definite limits to computation. And it's this other property that I mentioned before. It's a deep one between a fermion and the most bosons. Bosons, like photons of light, they don't have mass. So if you're on a beam of light, like Einstein thought of, you're living into a kind of eternal now. Whereas electrons do, and they travel more slowly, but they have a different kind of spin. Their spin is 1/2, and they interfere. And so we're making a transition somewhat from, if you like, electricity to photons. There's a relationship there. And real fast, what you can do wonderfully with the photons is multiplication and addition. Not very good at subtraction and division. But we've pretty much moved into the era now, moving from the electronic transistor, and the latest efforts are to a photonic transistor. A long way away from where we need to go, but there are very definite limits of what we can do with computation and the mind as we conceive it.
Let's go to Lance. I think he'll may get the last word on Coast to Coast AM with Dr. Bart Kosko. Go ahead, Lance.
Hey there, gentlemen. Hey, Bart. Hey, Ian. I'll make it quick. I could talk for hours. I've been getting massive downloads from what I consider the universe because I don't know where else it came from, and basically, and
from iHeart Media. Go ahead.
And I could see it in my mind's eye, and I just know it's straight from what we would call the source. And basically, what I think what it told me was that we're all connected. Every atom in the universe is connected intimately. And in the beginning, we're this infinite white light. It's hard for the human brain to imagine infinite white light, but that's what we are. But we're very, very intimate as well. We're very close together, and we're sharing all these stories with each other, all these feelings, and they're great. It's the most awesome place. this pure white light. And then we decide as a group, as a conscious effort, we decide, you know what, this is overwhelming, and we would like to experience, life again. So we explode out into the universe, all this chaos, all this stuff, all these planets, that's part of us. We become conscious beings on all levels, dinosaurs, this, that. And then we become humanoids, and humanoids have the conscious decision to start searching the universe in various ways and thinking very, very deeply and imagining all these different imaginations and thoughts and putting them into fruition. And a lot of them don't end up well. We end up with nuclear weapons and this and that, but we also end up with things that could go well, like AI. AI could go wrong. It could also go wrong. So we play all these games in the universe. We're out there as an infinite. It's an infinite universe as well. It's hard to wrap our mind around.
But we're going to run out of time here before you even get to a question for Bart. So if you had one, I'm just afraid I'm up against the clock. As you heard right there, that is the clock. Well, from Kosko to Bart Kosko. Listen, thank you so much for the time that you gave us. Let's do this again. Let's keep tracking this. Right?
Because of fun, Ian.
Always in the eternal now that I think we found in the last couple of hours. Very lively. And thank you so much for being a part of it. I'll be thinking about this and unpacking it in my head for a while. Enjoy your sabbatical. And for everybody else, I'll be back on again in, I don't know, like a month or something. But in the meantime, as I always say, I really hope that whatever the weather situation that's challenging you, you get by. California's under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of things out there. Be safe and know that all of you matter to all of us here at Coast to Coast. Thank you for everybody who's done a great job in producing the show tonight. Deus te amat, and I do too.